The candles burn low, their light shivering against the frost that creeps through the glass. The air tastes of pine resin and coal smoke, sweet at first, then heavy, then still. Every sound in the house feels amplified: the slow turning of a clock key, the soft rustle of paper wrapping, the sigh of a tired mother as she folds another scarf. Outside, the streets of London gleam like ribbons of black ice, and the carolers who pass beneath the window sing more for warmth than for joy. Their voices fade into the fog, swallowed by distance and the hush of snow. It is the winter of 1890, a season of invention, of empire, and of quiet despair. Steam curls above the railway lines as families journey home beneath a sky the color of iron. Shop windows glitter with tin toys and sugared fruit, while behind them, debt and hunger press close like shadows. The same trains that carry gifts to the wealthy bring cold and soot to the poor, and in drawing rooms across the city, Christmas cheer flickers beside worry that never quite dies. So, tonight, stay near the fire. Let the candlelight hold back the dark a little longer, because this is how a Victorian Christmas truly began, in a house of trembling light and lingering hope, when one family set out on a journey that would change how they remembered winter forever. The frost came early that year. It began as a fine shimmer upon the railings and rooftops, spreading like lace spun by invisible hands. By morning, it had claimed the windows of the house on Gower Street, sealing each pane in a delicate filigree of ice. Inside, the air was still and heavy with coal smoke and the faint scent of oranges, a luxury kept in the pantry for Christmas. The clock on the mantel had stopped sometime in the night, its silence louder than any chime. In the nursery, a single candle fought against the cold. Its flame bent and wavered, making the wallpaper's faded roses dance upon the walls. Beneath the quilt, young Thomas pressed his hands together for warmth. He could hear the city before he saw it, the far-off jingle of carriage bells, the iron groan of wheels on frozen cobblestones. The sound felt distant, as if London itself were wrapped in cloth. From the kitchen below came the scrape of a shovel, and his mother's voice calling softly to the maid. "Coal," she said, "the good kind, not the dusty bits that burned too fast and left the air bitter." The house breathed like a sleeping thing. Every stair creaked, every door exhaled a draught. Frost had crept inside through the smallest cracks, whitening the edges of the glassware and curling across the tiles. In the parlor, the father sat hunched over the hearth with his spectacles fogged, trying to coax life from the embers. His hair, once black, now glimmered like frost itself under the low light. Around him, papers lay scattered: railway timetables, folded letters, and one half-written note that began with "My dearest mother," then trailed off. Upstairs, Mrs. Whitby, still young, though the years had begun to show in her hands, tightened her shawl and went from room to room, checking windows and blankets. Her steps were soft, almost reverent. Each corner of the house seemed to hold a memory, a child's laughter, the echo of a long-ago quarrel, the faint trace of perfume that had belonged to someone no longer there. She paused by a window, her breath clouding the glass, and traced a circle into the frost. Outside, the sky was white as bone, and chimney smoke rose like prayers that never quite reached heaven. In the hall stood their luggage: 2 worn trunks, a small carpet bag, and a box tied with string. On its lid was written, in her careful hand, "To Whitby Hall, North Yorkshire." The journey would take a full day by train, if the weather held. If not, they would stop at York, she had said, rest the night, continue by carriage if they must. Her husband had nodded, though his eyes had remained on the fire. By 8 o'clock, the servants had gone to fetch water frozen in the pump. Steam curled through the rooms as kettles boiled, filling the air with a sweetness that almost felt like comfort. The children were dressed in wool and lace, mittens tied by ribbon. The father wound the stopped clock once more, and as it ticked to life, he smiled faintly, like a man who knows time will not wait. When they stepped outside, the frost greeted them like an old friend. The street shimmered silver under the early light. Across the way, a lamplighter paused to nod, his ladder dusted with snow, and for a moment, just a moment, the city seemed to hold its breath, as though even London itself wished them well on their Christmas journey north. The carriage door closed with a soft thud, the reins snapped, and the house beneath the frost grew quiet again, its windows watching as the family disappeared into the pale December morning. It had arrived 3 days before Christmas, slipped through the brass letter slot like a whisper from another world. The postman's boots had left twin crescents of snow on the step, already fading by the time Mrs. Whitby found the envelope lying on the mat. Its paper was thick, its edges rough and uneven, and the wax seal, deep red, impressed with a crest she hadn't seen in years, bore the faint outline of an ivy branch. She had held it for a long time before breaking the seal, turning it over in her gloved hands as if its weight might reveal its contents. The handwriting was unmistakable, broad, confident strokes, softened by age. Her mother's hand, she could almost see her sitting by the window at Whitby Hall, the winter light silvering her hair, a blanket draped across her knees as she wrote by the fire. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "the house has grown too quiet. Come home for Christmas. Bring the children. The train from King's Cross still stops at Whitby Junction, if the weather allows. Your father speaks of you often, though he will not say so aloud." By the time she reached the end of the letter, the words had blurred. She pressed it to her lips, tasting dust and ink, and folded it back into its envelope. The last line, written in her mother's smaller, trembling hand, read simply, "I would like to see the children before the spring." She had shown it to her husband that night, after supper. He'd been reading the Evening Standard by lamplight, his spectacles reflecting the orange glow. At first, he said nothing, tracing the edges of the letter with his thumb. Then he sighed. "It's been nearly 6 years," he said quietly. "Your father was never one for sentiment." "Nor you," she replied, though not unkindly. He folded the paper in two and looked toward the window, where frost feathered the glass. "We'll go," he said finally. "The children should see where you grew up. Perhaps it will do us all good." After that, everything had moved quickly, tickets purchased, trunks aired, the maid sent to mend torn hems. Still, the house had taken on a strange hush, as if aware of its own approaching abandonment. The days shortened, the air sharpened, and each morning brought a new crust of ice along the sills. Eleanor found herself rereading the letter in odd moments while stirring porridge, while brushing Thomas's hair, while standing by the fire long after the embers had died. It spoke of the north as if it were another country, one both familiar and impossibly far away. She imagined the moors stretching white beneath a low sun, the hall's chimneys wreathed in smoke, her mother waiting at the window with her knitting laid aside. The night before their departure, she packed the letter into a small velvet pouch and slipped it inside her coat pocket. She couldn't say why. Perhaps it was habit, or superstition, or something older than either. Outside, London lay silent under the first true snow of winter. The gas lamps along Gower Street burned dim, their light bending through flurries of white. A carriage passed, wheels crunching softly, and then there was only the steady drift of flakes, the faint sound of a bell somewhere in the distance. She stood at the window until her breath fogged the glass, the letter warm against her heart. Behind her, the children slept, and her husband's slow breathing filled the room. Tomorrow, the journey would begin, and with it, the crossing from one world to another. But for now, she whispered a single word into the quiet. Not a prayer, not a name, just home. And in that moment, it was enough. The packing began before dawn, when the air still held the brittle stillness of a night not yet gone. The single lamp in the parlor burned low, casting a thin, amber light that trembled across the walls. Mrs. Whitby moved through it like a ghost in her nightdress, sleeves rolled and hair unpinned, her breath fogging faintly in the cold. Around her, trunks yawned open like the mouths of sleeping beasts. Each creak of leather straps, each fold of fabric, sounded louder than it should, the house echoing with the quiet weight of departure. On the table lay the items she'd chosen first, the things she couldn't bear to leave behind. A photograph in a tarnished frame, taken when she and her husband were newly married, their faces solemn beneath the photographer's dark cloth. A small glass vial of lavender oil, nearly empty but still fragrant. A child's wooden rattle, its paint worn away to pale wood. These she wrapped in a length of muslin and placed carefully at the bottom of her trunk, beneath layers of folded wool. The smell of mothballs and old linen rose like the scent of time itself. Upstairs, Thomas and Clara whispered to each other in their beds. They had woken to the sound of drawers opening, to the shuffle of footsteps on the stairs. "Is it today?" Clara asked, her voice barely more than a breath. "It's today," Thomas replied, pulling his blanket close. His toy soldier, the one with the missing arm, lay beside his pillow. He picked it up and tucked it into his coat pocket, certain that soldiers should never be left behind. By 6, the house was alive with the quiet rhythm of preparation. The maid carried in hot water, her cheeks red from the pump outside, steam curling from the pails like breath. Mr. Whitby sat by the fire, sorting through his papers, receipts, bank drafts, letters from clients, each one folded and sealed into an envelope marked urgent. He had the look of a man both eager to leave and reluctant to be gone, the way travelers often do when they sense that something, though they cannot name it, will change while they are away. Eleanor tied up the last bundle of children's clothes, her fingers stiff with cold. The frost had crept down the inside of the window again, curling in perfect white veins. Through it, the city looked blurred, as if seen through tears. Outside, a milkman's cart rattled over the stones, and somewhere a church bell tolled 7. In the kitchen, breakfast waited untouched, a pot of porridge turning thick and grey. The fire hissed in protest each time she opened the door to carry something out to the hall. There, the trunks stood ready, their brass corners dulled by use. A scarf slipped from one and fell to the floor, its fringe brushing her slipper as if to ask, "Are you certain?" She hesitated for the briefest moment, hand resting on the stair rail. Her eyes traced the narrow hallway, the clock, the small painting of the sea her father had given her before her marriage. London had been home for 10 years. It had taken her youth, her children's first words, her quiet nights, and given her in return the steady hum of work and soot and survival. And now it would let her go without protest. By 8, the cab was waiting outside, the horse stamping in the cold. The driver tipped his hat when she appeared in the doorway, her face pale against the dark wool of her coat. Behind her, Thomas and Clara clutched their parcels, their breath rising in clouds. Mr. Whitby locked the door and slipped the key into his pocket. The sound of it turning echoed faintly up the stairwell, like the closing of a chapter no one yet knew they'd begun. As the carriage pulled away, the house stood still beneath the frost windows dim, curtains drawn, holding within its quiet rooms the warmth of everything they hadn't packed. King's Cross in winter was a world unto itself, half cathedral, half cavern. Beneath its iron arches, steam gathered thick as fog, swallowing sound and shape alike. The air smelled of coal, oil, and wet wool. Every breath tasted faintly of metal. As the Whitby family stepped from the cab, the echo of hooves and shouts melted into the endless hum of departure, porters calling, engines sighing, the great heart of the city beating through rails and rivets. Mr. Whitby paid the driver and helped his wife down, his gloved hand firm beneath hers. Eleanor's breath trembled in the cold. Above them, the vast glass roof was mottled with frost, each pane catching what little light filtered through the London haze. Around them, hundreds of travellers hurried through the station, soldiers bound for barracks, merchants weighed down with crates, women with baskets wrapped in shawls. Every face seemed caught between haste and hope. Clara clutched her mother's skirt, eyes wide. "It's like a church," she whispered. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "a church of iron and smoke." The porter, a thin man with a red scarf and a limp, took their trunks and vanished into the mist, leaving behind the faint jingle of keys. They followed his shape as best they could, passing newsstands, shouting vendors, and the scent of roasted chestnuts that clung stubbornly even here. Thomas stopped to stare at the timetable board rows of chalked destinations: York, Durham, Newcastle, Whitby. He touched the letters with one mittened finger, as if to make the journey real. A whistle shrieked somewhere far off, long and piercing. The sound rolled through the station like a command, and with it came motion, people moving as one body, voices rising, doors slamming. The Whitbys stepped aside to let a wave of travellers surge past. Sailors in heavy coats, a mother with a crying infant, a boy carrying a parcel taller than himself. The tide ebbed just as suddenly, leaving silence in its wake, the brief stillness between departures. Eleanor found herself studying the faces that remained the ones who were not travelling. A woman stood alone near the ticket booth, her eyes fixed on a departing train. A young man waved from a window until his figure blurred into smoke. So many meetings, so many partings, each one a story vanishing into steam. When they reached platform 4, their train waited, a black serpent of iron, breathing heat and noise. The carriages gleamed beneath the gas lamps, brass handles polished, windows fogged from the warmth inside. A guard in a peaked cap called for final boarding, his voice swallowed almost at once by the hiss of steam. Thomas pressed close to his father, the rumble beneath their feet thrilling and frightening all at once. "Does it go fast?" he asked. Mr. Whitby smiled, adjusting his scarf. "Faster than the wind, if you listen right." They climbed aboard, the steps slick with snow. Inside, compartments smelled of smoke, wool, and the faint sweetness of tea spilled long ago. Eleanor brushed frost from the window and settled the children beside her. Outside, porters shouted, whistles blew again, doors slammed. Mr. Whitby placed the folded tickets in his coat pocket and exhaled, his breath clouding the glass. "Are we far now, Mama?" Clara murmured, already drowsy. "Not yet," Eleanor said softly, "but soon." The train shuddered once, then again. A deep groan rippled through the carriages, with a final whistle that seemed to echo off every wall. The iron road came alive. As the wheels turned, the great arches of King's Cross slipped away, replaced by rows of dim lamps and frozen rooftops, then by fields of white and silence. The city receded into smoke. Ahead lay the long rails, north the road of iron, the road home stretching into a horizon of snow and memory. And behind them, London exhaled its breath of steam and sorrow, watching another family vanish into winter. The whistle came again, long and low, like the sigh of a creature stirring from sleep. The train shuddered beneath their feet, iron wheels grinding against the frozen rails, sparks glinting in the dark. Then, with a lurch that made Clara gasp and Thomas laugh, they were moving slowly at first, then faster, the rhythm of the wheels becoming a heartbeat that carried them away from London and into the white silence beyond. Through the window, the city slipped past like a dream in reverse. Gas lamps blurred into ribbons of gold, carriage wheels flickered through fog, and the silhouettes of chimneys rose like sentinels in the smoke. The world was all motion and colour, then suddenly none at all, replaced by open fields veiled in snow and fences swallowed by drifts. The sound changed too, from the clatter of stone to the muffled thunder of iron over ice. Inside the carriage, time stretched. The compartment was lit by a single lamp, its glow soft and uneven. Frost rimed the corners of the glass, and their reflections shimmered faintly in it, 4 travellers suspended between places. Eleanor kept her gloved hands folded in her lap, feeling the vibration of the train hum through her bones. Across from her, Mr. Whitby sat with a newspaper open but unread, his eyes fixed on the dark beyond the window. Every few minutes, he cleared his throat, adjusted his collar, and turned a page that made no sound. Clara had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, her curls pressed into the wool of her coat. Thomas sat opposite, his eyes wide with wonder, his small fingers tracing the frost patterns that bloomed like ferns on the glass. Occasionally, he leaned close to whisper something, a question, a thought, A secret he couldn't quite keep to himself, but his words were always drowned by the rattle of the rails. The train passed through towns that looked like lanterns scattered across the dark, each one flickering briefly, then gone. Sometimes, at the smaller stations, the whistle would sound and they'd glimpse shapes moving through the snow, porters waving lamps, passengers huddled in scarves, a dog chasing the departing light. Then the world would close again, and all that remained was the endless stretch of white. As the hours deepened, the warmth in the carriage began to fade. Breath fogged the air in slow, ghostly curls. Eleanor rubbed Clara's hands between her own, then reached across to adjust Thomas's scarf. "You'll catch cold if you don't keep still," she murmured. He smiled sleepily, resting his head against the window. Outside, the stars had begun to appear, faint pinpricks of silver above the dark line of the horizon. Mr. Whitby looked down at his pocket watch. "9:30, he said softly, more to himself than to her. "We'll reach Peterborough before midnight, weather permitting." Eleanor nodded, though her eyes were far away. The letter in her pocket felt heavier now, its folded edges pressing against her heart. She thought of her mother's voice, the way it softened when she read aloud by firelight, the faint scent of lilac soap that had lingered on her shawl. She wondered if the old house still sounded the same, if the wind still sang through the chimney in winter, if the floorboards still sighed when someone walked the hall at night. The train plunged into a tunnel. For a moment, all light vanished. The lamp flickered, the glass turned black, and in the reflection she saw only their faces, pale and fragile, suspended in the dark. Then, as suddenly as it came, the tunnel ended, and the light returned. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, slow, deliberate flakes drifting through the lamplight. They slid past mile after mile of sleeping countryside, toward a place where memory and distance blurred into one. And as the rails hummed beneath them, Eleanor realized the truth of it. Every journey forward is also a return, and every winter, no matter how cold, carries the ghost of home. By the second hour, the rhythm of the train had become a kind of lullaby, steady, patient, almost human. The wheels spoke in their own language, a repeating chant of iron and time. Outside, the snow thickened into a curtain, swallowing the lamps and fences and all trace of the road. The world beyond the glass was white and endless, like a page waiting for someone's story. Inside the compartment, silence had settled. Not the heavy silence of tension, but the gentle hush that comes when words feel unnecessary. The children dozed in their seats, their breath misting faintly in the lamplight. Thomas's toy soldier had fallen to the floor, one wooden arm pointing north as if it, too, longed for the destination they could not yet see. Eleanor watched the snow for a long while, her hand resting on the edge of the window. The frost beneath her glove was cold enough to sting. Each flake that struck the glass seemed to hesitate before melting, leaving small trails that looked like veins across the pane. In their soft patterns, she thought she could almost read something, a message, a memory, but it vanished before she could make sense of it. Across from her, her husband dozed lightly, his chin tilted toward his chest. The lines around his eyes had deepened in the last few years. London had done that, the endless work, the ledgers, the polite conversations that always circled the same dull topics. It was a different kind of exhaustion than farming or sea work. It was the tiredness of being always civilized, never still. She studied him in the flickering light, the man who once wrote her poems, who once laughed loudly enough to draw stares in crowded rooms. Now he carried his weariness with dignity, like a coat he could no longer take off. She reached for his hand but stopped halfway, unsure if the gesture would comfort him or remind him how long it had been since either of them needed it. A sudden jolt broke the quiet. The train curved, metal shrieking, softly as it met the bend. Somewhere in another carriage, a child cried, quickly hushed. Clara stirred in her sleep, murmuring something, a dream perhaps, and pressed closer to her mother's side. Eleanor smoothed her hair and whispered, "It's all right, darling. Go back to dreaming." For a time, the silence resumed its rhythm. breath, rattle, wind. The lamp above them hummed faintly, its flame shrinking as the oil burned low. The compartment smelled of coal dust and damp wool, of travel and fatigue. Through the small crack between the curtains, she caught glimpses of the other passengers as they passed through the corridor, faces blurred by movement. A young couple sharing tea from a flask, an old woman knitting in the dim light, a soldier gazing at nothing at all. Every compartment seemed its own world, small, fragile universes of warmth and waiting. At one stop, a porter brushed snow from the platform and shouted something indistinct. The door opened briefly, letting in a breath of cold so sharp it bit at the throat. Eleanor shivered, clutching Clara's blanket tighter. Outside, the station lamps burned through the fog, and she saw the faint outline of a name painted on the wall, Grantham. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Mr. Whitby woke with a start when the train began to move again. He blinked once, adjusted his spectacles, and smiled faintly at her. "Still snowing?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Still." He nodded, leaned back, and closed his eyes once more. The whistle blew, low and distant, and the sound carried through the night like a reminder that they were part of something larger than themselves. A procession of strangers crossing through the heart of winter, each carrying their own silence. Eleanor looked out again at the falling snow. The darkness had thickened. The fields were gone. All that remained was the reflection in the glass, her own pale face, her sleeping family, and the faint shimmer of the lamp above. And as she watched the reflection tremble with every turn of the wheels, she realized that silence was not emptiness at all. It was memory, the kind that follows you wherever you go, whispering softly between the stations of your life. By morning, the compartment smelled of cold bread and soot. The children stirred as the first light crept over the fields, grey and thin, filtering through the frost-streaked windows. The snow had not stopped. It had simply changed its mood. It no longer fell in wild drifts, but in slow, deliberate flakes, the kind that seemed to hover before landing, as though uncertain whether the earth deserved its touch. Thomas was the first to wake fully. His nose left a small print against the window pane, a tiny smudge in the shape of curiosity. Beyond the glass, the world rolled past in white silence. Cottages with sagging roofs, sheep half buried in snow, a man trudging along a road with a lantern that looked dim even in daylight. The train rattled through it all, a black scar cutting across a page of frost. Eleanor handed him a small piece of bread wrapped in paper. It had been baked the day before, its crust now hard and dusted with crumbs. He took it without complaint, his fingers stiff with cold. Beside him, Clara yawned, rubbing her eyes with a mittened hand. Her curls had escaped their ribbon, haloed with static from the wool of her coat. "Are we there yet?" she mumbled. "Not yet," Eleanor said, smiling softly. "But we're closer." Across from them, Mr. Whitby unfolded himself from uneasy sleep, his collar creased, his spectacles slightly askew. He reached for his pocket watch out of habit, then paused when he noticed Eleanor watching him. "Nearly 9, he said quietly. "We'll reach York before noon if the snow holds." The rhythm of the train filled the spaces between them. It wasn't unpleasant, it was the sound of movement, of something steady in a world where so little stayed still. Outside, the fields gave way to towns, rows of brick houses, factory chimneys standing like grey sentinels over silent yards. From some of them, smoke rose sluggishly, curling against the sky. Others stood cold, their fires long gone out, their windows frosted into blindness. At one crossing, the train slowed, and for a brief moment, they passed within sight of the workers' cottages. Children played in the snow outside, faces pink and ungloved, their laughter visible in clouds of breath. A woman stood at a doorway, apron dusted with flour, a rolling pin clutched in one hand. She looked up just as the carriage passed, her gaze catching Eleanor's through the window. There was something in her eyes, not envy, not pity, something quieter, something like knowing. Then the moment was gone. and the landscape rolled on, endless and white. Inside, the air grew heavier with the scent of coal. The stove at the end of the carriage hissed and popped, sending up small clouds of ash that caught the light like tiny black snowflakes. Eleanor brushed a bit from Clara's sleeve, then another from her own lap. "Bread and soot," she said softly, half to herself. "That's all we ever seem to take with us." Mr. Whitby looked up from his paper. "It's the same for everyone," he said. "No one escapes the soot, no matter how fine their clothes." His words lingered long after he returned to reading. The train picked up speed, the whistle echoing over the flat country. The frost on the windows began to melt where the lamp's heat touched it, and the water ran down in thin silver lines, like tears. Thomas leaned close to trace them with his finger, following each drop until it vanished into the wood of the sill. Eleanor watched her children, her heart swelling with a quiet ache. They looked so small against the vastness outside, yet so complete in their wonder little hearts carried north through snow and smoke toward a home they barely remembered. The whistle blew again, long and low. The bread was gone, the soot remained, and the train rolled ever onward through a world that smelled of fire and frost toward whatever waited beyond the next white mile. By late morning, the train had grown warmer. The iron stove at the end of the carriage glowed faintly red, and the air shimmered with the mingled scents of coal smoke, damp wool, and strong tea. The passengers had settled into the quiet rhythm of travel, an unspoken agreement that conversation came only when the wheels slowed or the whistle broke the air. Between stations, they were all content to listen to the song of the rails and the faint pulse of the engine ahead. It was during one such lull that the stranger entered. The compartment door slid open with a soft hiss, and a gust of cold air followed him in. He was tall but stooped slightly, his greatcoat dusted with snow, his gloves worn to the thread. Around his neck hung a silver watch chain that gleamed even in the dim light, a fine thing, out of place on a man whose boots were scuffed and whose hat brim was frayed. "Beg your pardon," he said, his voice polite but tired. "Would you mind terribly if I shared your froze compartment? The others are full." Mr. Whitby rose halfway, gesturing to the seat opposite. "Of course, there's room enough for all." The stranger nodded in gratitude, setting a small case at his feet before easing himself onto the bench. When he removed his hat, Eleanor saw that his hair was prematurely white, though his face could not have been more than 40. He sat quietly for several minutes, eyes on the frost-webbed window, until the train lurched forward again. Only then did he speak. "Strange thing, isn't it?" he murmured. "How the snow can make the world look peaceful even when it's only hiding the mess beneath." Eleanor smiled faintly. "It does make everything quieter." He returned her smile, though his eyes did not soften. "Quieter, yes, but not cleaner. The soot always finds its way through. Even snow can't bury it for long." Thomas, who had been pretending not to listen, leaned forward with curiosity. "Do you travel a lot, sir?" The stranger chuckled, a sound low and kind. "More than I'd like, lad. Too much, perhaps. There's no rest on the rails, only pauses." He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small paper parcel, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a few boiled sweets. "You've a soldier there, haven't you?" he said, nodding toward Thomas's toy. "Take one for the march, and one for your sister." Thomas hesitated, looking to his mother. Eleanor nodded. "Thank you," she said softly. "Think nothing of it." He waved the notion away and leaned back, gazing out the window. "Used to give those to my own boy. He'd count the miles with every sweet. Said it made the journey shorter. I never had the heart to tell him it doesn't work that way." His voice faltered near the end, and the silence that followed felt thick enough to touch. Mr. Whitby shifted, clearing his throat. "And where does this journey take you now, sir?" The stranger's hand tightened around the watch chain. The faint clink of metal filled the quiet. "North," he said after a pause. "Always north. There's a churchyard in Durham I've been meaning to visit. My wife's been there a while. I'd best not keep her waiting another Christmas." No one spoke after that. The rhythm of the train filled the gap, the clatter, and sigh of the wheels, the low moan of wind pressing against glass. Eleanor turned her gaze to the passing countryside, though her thoughts remained with the stranger and his invisible grief. When the train stopped briefly at York, he stood, gathered his case, and tipped his hat to them all. "Safe travels," he said. "Keep your fires burning." He was gone before Thomas could wave. Outside, his figure vanished into the falling snow, and for a long time afterward, the faint reflection of his silver watch chain lingered in the glass, gleaming like memory itself, too brief to hold, too bright to forget. The light began to fade by late afternoon, dimming from silver to grey, and finally to that deep blue hour before dusk, when everything seems to hold its breath. The train slowed as it entered a stretch of country where the hills rose sharply on either side, their ridges crowned with snow and bare trees that clutched at the sky. The passengers leaned toward the windows, drawn to the dark line ahead, a tunnel carved straight through the hillside, its mouth gaping like the entrance to another world. Inside the compartment, the lamplight wavered. The children pressed close to the glass, watching the black shape grow larger with every beat of the rails. Clara whispered, "Is it a cave?" Her voice trembled with excitement. Thomas shook his head solemnly, as though he were already wise enough to know the answer. "It's a tunnel. They made it with hammers and fire. It goes right through the mountain." Eleanor smiled but said nothing. Her husband folded his paper and tucked it beside him, glancing once at the watch in his waistcoat pocket. 2 miles through," he murmured. "We'll be in the dark for a few minutes. Hold tight when we go in." The whistle cried once a single, echoing note that bounced between the frozen hills. Then came the plunge. For a heartbeat, the world turned to shadow. The window glass reflected nothing but their faces pale, suspended in a blackness so complete it seemed to swallow even sound. The iron wheels roared against the walls of stone, sending up sparks that flared and vanished like brief stars. The children clutched at each other, half afraid, half delighted by the sudden storm of noise. The tunnel's air was different, damp, metallic, thick with the smell of smoke and earth. Condensation formed on the glass and ran in trembling lines down the pane. Eleanor could feel the weight of the hill pressing above them, the ground itself breathing in slow, rumbling sighs. She imagined the hundreds of men who had carved this path years ago, their lanterns swaying in the dark, their lungs filled with dust, their laughter swallowed by the same echoes that now carried her family northward. Clara whimpered and buried her face in her mother's sleeve. "It's only a shadow, love," Eleanor whispered, stroking her hair, the light still waiting on the other side. Mr. Whitby sat upright, his hand resting on the window ledge. The faint red glow of the stove flickered across his face, making him look for a moment younger, or perhaps older than she remembered. He said nothing, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. He had never liked tunnels. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The darkness broke apart into a burst of light. The train shot out from the hillside, and for a moment everyone blinked, stunned by the brilliance of snow and sky. The fields opened wide again, the air clearer, the sound freer. A few passengers laughed softly, the nervous relief of people who had passed through something vast and unknowable. Thomas pressed his palms to the window, eyes wide. "We made it through," he said, his breath fogging the glass. "Yes," Eleanor murmured, watching the black mouth of the tunnel recede into the distance behind them. "We did." The sun, pale as pewter, hovered low over the horizon, and the snow caught its light like shards of glass. For the first time since leaving London, Eleanor felt something like warmth not in her hands, but in her chest. Perhaps it was hope. Perhaps it was simply the strange comfort of knowing they had survived the dark and come out into light once more. The train rattled on, its shadow long and thin across the white hills. Behind them, the tunnel closed, like a memory silent, eternal, and waiting for the next soul, brave enough to pass through its heart. The train slowed sometime after midnight, its long whistle unfurling through the stillness like a call to the moon. Eleanor woke with a start, disoriented by the rhythm's sudden change. For hours, the wheels had carried them in that steady, unbroken pulse, and now silence came like a held breath. The compartment dimmed as the lamp flickered low, its oil nearly spent. Outside, the dark pressed close to the glass, broken only by the faint glow of lanterns swaying on a distant platform. Mr. Whitby stirred beside her. "A stop," he murmured, voice heavy with sleep. "Must be Thirsk, or perhaps Malton." He adjusted his spectacles and peered through the window. No sign on the wall. Snows buried the platform name. The door at the end of the carriage slid open, and cold air swept in. A porter stepped through, his lantern cutting a soft arc of light through the haze. 20 minutes, ladies and gents," he called. "Tea and bread in the waiting room. Stretch your legs, if you please mind the snow." His voice was thin, as though it, too, might freeze before reaching the far end of the train. Eleanor rubbed her gloved hands together. "We should take the children out for a moment," she whispered. "They've been still too long." Mr. Whitby hesitated, then nodded. "Wrap them tight." Outside, the night was a cathedral of snow. The platform glowed faintly under the light of 2 gas lamps, their glass domes fogged and rimmed with ice. Flakes drifted slowly down, glittering like dust in a frozen heaven. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs. Each breath felt borrowed. Thomas leapt down first, boots crunching into the powder. "It's so quiet," he whispered, and it was unnervingly so. Even the hiss of steam seemed subdued, muffled beneath the weight of the cold. The other passengers moved like ghosts through the haze, men in heavy coats, women with shawls drawn over their hair, children half asleep in their mothers' arms. Lanterns bobbed among them, brief stars in a sky of fog. The waiting room stood at the far end of the platform, its windows fogged with warmth. When they entered, a wave of heat and light struck their faces. A small coal fire burned in the grate, and the air smelled faintly of tea and singed wool. A woman in a blue uniform poured steaming water into cups, her hands red from the heat. "Bit of a drift near Pickering," she said to anyone listening. "We'll be delayed till it's cleared. You've luck enough to be waiting here and not stuck on the line." Eleanor accepted a cup with a murmur of thanks. The tea was thin, but the heat of it steadied her. Clara sat on her lap, drowsy but content, while Thomas hovered near the window, watching flakes gather against the glass. The stranger with the watch chain was there too, or perhaps just a man who looked like him sitting in a corner, with his case at his feet, staring into the fire, as if seeing something within it no one else could. When he noticed her gaze, he inclined his head slightly in greeting, then returned to his thoughts. Outside, the whistle blew again, softer this time, beckoning. The passengers roused themselves, pulling scarves tight and finishing their tea. The room emptied quickly, leaving behind the faint scent of smoke and the ghostly warmth of breath on glass. As they stepped back into the cold, Eleanor felt the hush settle again. The station lights blurred through the falling snow. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, twice, then was silent. When the train began to move, the sound was almost gentle, the sigh of something ancient returning to its course. The children pressed their faces to the window as the station slipped away, its 2 lamps shrinking into pinpricks of gold. And as they vanished into the darkness once more, Eleanor thought of the porter's words, "luck enough to be waiting here." She wondered if luck was truly what kept any of them moving through such nights, or if it was something quieter, something like faith, the belief that every stop, no matter how cold or brief, would always lead them forward into morning. By the time they reached York, dawn was still far off. The snow had thickened again, blanketing the tracks until the train could go no farther. The conductor announced that the line north had been closed by drifts. The rest of the journey would have to wait until morning. A murmur passed through the passengers, not outrage, only weary resignation. Travel in winter was never certain, and England, for all its rails and timetables, still bowed to weather. The Whitbys gathered their belongings in silence, stepping down onto the platform where the lamps burned dim behind halos of frost. The town beyond the station was muffled, its rooftops vanishing beneath white mounds. A carriage waited, its driver huddled beneath a blanket. "Hotel Victoria, is it?" he asked. Mr. Whitby nodded. "Yes, if there's room left for us." The driver laughed, a sound low and humorless. "There's always room. Whether there's warmth, I couldn't say." They arrived at the hotel a half hour later, the wheels of the carriage grinding through snow that rose nearly to the axles. The building loomed out of the storm, a grand structure once, now faded and grey, its windows dull as tarnished mirrors. A gaslight flickered weakly above the door. The brass plate that bore its name had gone green with age, letters softened by years of rain. Inside, the air was warmer, but stale. The smell of damp plaster and coal lingered in the hall. A clerk in a wrinkled waistcoat greeted them without looking up from his ledger. "Family of 4. You're in luck, 1 room left. Attic floor. Fire's out, but blankets are clean." Eleanor exchanged a glance with her husband, who nodded, too tired to argue. "That will do," she said. They climbed narrow stairs that creaked beneath their boots. The hallway above was dimly lit by a single gas jet that hissed faintly, its flame no larger than a candle. Wallpaper peeled at the seams, curling like old parchment. The room itself was small, with a slanted ceiling and one window crusted with frost. A single iron bed and a narrow cot stood against the wall, both covered in rough woolen blankets. Thomas pressed his hand against the glass, marveling at how the frost crackled beneath his touch. Clara curled up on the bed at once, too weary to speak. Mr. Whitby knelt by the hearth, striking a match against the grate. It sputtered and died, leaving the faint scent of sulphur. "The coal's damp," he muttered. "We'll manage without it." Eleanor unpacked a tin of biscuits and a small jar of jam, their supper, meagre but enough. The children ate in silence, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. The walls groaned as the wind pressed against them. Somewhere nearby, pipes clanged like distant bells. When the children finally drifted to sleep, she stood by the window, watching snow sweep in waves across the square below. A lamplighter made his rounds, his figure small and lonely beneath the storm. Beyond him, the cathedral spire rose into darkness, its edges blurred by falling white. She thought of her mother's letter, the way the ink had faded near the edges, as if time itself were trying to erase the urgency in her words. "Before the spring," she had written. Eleanor pressed her forehead to the cold glass and whispered, "We're coming." Behind her, her husband sat by the cold hearth, his coat still buttoned, eyes half closed. "We'll continue at first light," he said. "They'll clear the line by then." She nodded. The wind rattled the window latch, and she tightened it gently, her fingers trembling. That night, she dreamed of trains moving beneath the sea, their lanterns glowing through green water. Passengers drifted inside, weightless, their faces pale and calm. Somewhere above, she could hear the sound of bells, not warning, not mourning, only time itself passing through the deep. When she woke, it was to silence. The lamp had gone out, and the room was a soft blue from the snow's reflection. The air was so cold it burned to breathe. In the dimness, she reached for her children, their small forms warm beneath the blankets. She pulled the covers closer and listened to the faint whistle of wind through the eaves. The Hotel Victoria slept around them still, indifferent, and without warmth, holding its travellers the way winter holds the earth, tightly, but never tenderly. Morning arrived without sunlight. It crept instead as a dim greyness, heavy and reluctant, pressing through the thin curtains of the attic room. The fire had long gone cold, and the air inside felt like breath that had forgotten to warm itself. Frost edged the wallpaper in delicate trails, curling around the corners like white ivy. Every sound seemed swallowed, the ticking of the watch on the bedside table, the slow creak of wood contracting in the cold, even the children's breathing muffled beneath layers of wool. Eleanor rose first. Her hands were stiff as she laced her boots and pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. When she crossed the room, her breath left a faint mist behind her. She tried the latch of the window. It had come loose in the night, the upper pane pushed open by the force of the wind. A thin draught sliced through the room like a knife, whistling softly. carrying with it the smell of soot and snow. She pressed her fingers against the frame, tried to force it closed, but it refused. The wood had swollen in the damp, and the hinges, rusted and old, would not bend. She looked over her shoulder at the children still bundled in sleep, Thomas curled like a question mark beneath the quilt, Clara's small hand resting on her brother's back. The sight of them, fragile against the world's coldness, filled her with both gratitude and fear. They were too young to understand the brittleness of life, too innocent to feel how thin the walls of safety truly were. Mr. Whitby stirred behind her. "Is it morning?" he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Barely," she said. "The window's open again. I can't make it stay shut." He rose with a sigh and came to her side, rubbing his hands together before taking hold of the latch. Together they forced the pane down as far as it would go, wedging a comb and a strip of folded newspaper into the gap. The wind quieted to a soft murmur, though cold still seeped through. "That will have to do," he said, stepping back. His breath clouded before him. "We'll be gone soon enough." Eleanor nodded, but did not move. She watched as the frost began to form anew on the inside of the glass, thin white veins spreading upward like a living thing. Beyond the window, York was still half buried. Roofs sagged under snow, chimneys smoked weakly against the grey sky. A single carriage trudged through the square below, its wheels leaving shallow trenches before the wind erased them again. Downstairs, faint sound stirred the hollow clang of pots, the low hum of voices in the breakfast room. She thought of hot tea, of eggs and toast, of warmth she might borrow for a few moments, but the thought did not comfort her. The hotel had a way of making everything taste faintly of distance, as though no one here truly belonged to the living. She returned to the bed and touched Clara's hair, fine and tangled from sleep. "Time to wake, love," she whispered. The child stirred, blinking up at her mother's face, framed by pale light. "Is it still snowing?" "Yes," Eleanor said, smiling faintly. "Still snowing." Mr. Whitby buttoned his coat, winding his scarf tight. "The porter says they'll clear the tracks by midday. We'll take the noon train. Then we'll need to be ready." Eleanor helped the children dress wool over linen, scarves doubled, mittens tied at the wrists. She wrapped the last of the biscuits in paper and tucked them into her satchel. The letter from her mother rested safely inside her coat pocket, folded so many times now it felt like a part of her own heartbeat. Before leaving, she turned to the window once more. The wind had begun to rise again, pressing against the pane until it rattled faintly. The comb in the gap quivered but held. Frost curled along the edges, sealing it like a scar. "Let it be," she whispered. "We've no strength left to fight the cold." As they stepped into the hall, the draught followed them, thin, insistent, almost human, as if the window itself sighed at their leaving. And down in the courtyard, unseen beneath the falling snow, a single flake melted against the frozen glass and ran downward in a slow silver line like a tear shed for those still journeying north. Through the endless, patient winter, the church bells began before the light. At first, they sounded distant, hollow, uncertain, muffled by snow, but slowly they gathered strength, each toll blooming through the frozen air, until it seemed the whole town was breathing in rhythm with their sound. They came from somewhere beyond the rooftops, from a steeple lost in the fog, yet their echo reached even to the attic window of the Hotel Victoria, where the Whitby family stood preparing to leave. Eleanor paused as she tied her daughter's scarf, listening. The sound carried something solemn and tender, not joy, exactly, but endurance. Bells that had rung through war, plague, and bitter winters long past, now tolled to remind those still standing that time continued, indifferent and kind in equal measure. Clara turned her head toward the window, eyes wide. "They sound like the sea," she said softly. Eleanor smiled. "Yes, love, like waves that never stop coming." Down in the square, the world was slowly stirring, awake. The night's snowfall had been heavy, and every roof and cart stood bowed beneath its weight. Men with shovels cleared narrow paths through the drifts, their breath rising in white plumes. A milk cart creaked by, wheels nearly vanishing in the powder. The bells continued, their sound weaving through the hush of morning like a hymn sung for no one in particular. Mr. Whitby stood at the window, coat already buttoned, hat in hand. He had shaved in cold water, leaving his skin raw and pink. "We should be at the station before 9, he said, glancing at his watch. "The porter swears the rails are open again." "Will the train be warm this time?" Thomas asked, tugging at his sleeve. His cheeks were flushed, his eyes bright with the excitement of moving again. "It will be warmer than this old room," his father replied, forcing a smile. "And that's comfort enough." Eleanor finished packing the satchel, the children's gloves, the letter from her mother, the last of the bread, and slipped it over her shoulder. The air in the room was so cold it felt sharp to breathe. When she exhaled, her breath hung between them like smoke. She touched the window once more before leaving. The frost had deepened overnight, curling into intricate patterns that resembled ferns or feathers. Beneath the thin ice, she could see the faint orange flicker of lamps far below. The bells grew louder as they stepped into the hall. Other travellers emerged from their rooms, faces pale with sleep, and cold businessmen with valises, a mother holding a crying infant, 2 students in long coats whispering Latin as they descended the stairs. The old clerk nodded as they passed, his ink-stained fingers wrapped around a teacup that had gone cold long ago. Outside, the sound of the bells met them full and clear. The cold was clean, sharp as crystal. Each note seemed to hang suspended in the air before breaking softly against the snow. Eleanor tilted her face upward. Flakes landed on her lashes, melting into tears that never quite fell. The carriage waited near the gate, its horse stamping impatiently. Mr. Whitby helped the children climb inside while she lingered for a moment on the step. The square looked almost sacred in its stillness, the faint halo of smoke above chimneys, the cathedral's outline emerging slowly through the fog, the bells still tolling as if blessing each departure. When she finally climbed in beside her husband, the carriage wheels crunched forward. Through the window, the church tower came into view, tall, austere, its bells swinging against the pale sky. They passed a woman scattering crumbs for pigeons, her shawl pulled tight, her breath visible in the air. She crossed herself as the carriage went by. Eleanor watched until the tower disappeared behind the snow. "They sound like they're ringing for us," she murmured. "Maybe they are," her husband said. "Maybe they always ring for those still traveling." As they turned onto the road leading back to the station, the bells faded into distance, their final notes trembling over the white roofs like a farewell. The children leaned close to the window, whispering to each other. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment and listened, carrying the sound with her, soft, steady, and enduring the heartbeat of a frozen city bidding them onward toward whatever waited in the cold north ahead. The dining room smelled faintly of coal dust and burnt toast, a smell that belonged not to food, but to survival. Pale light seeped through the frost-smeared windows, spilling across long wooden tables where travelers sat hunched in coats, their breaths visible in the chill air. The fire at the far end of the room had burned down to grey ash, its warmth more imagined than real. Every sound, the scrape of a spoon, the whisper of a page turning, seemed softened by the weight of the morning. The Whitbys took their places near the hearth, though no flame remained within it. Eleanor's fingers brushed against the table's surface, cold as stone, worn smooth by countless hands before hers. A maid approached with a tray of tea and porridge, her apron damp from melting snow. "There's milk, if you've coin for it," she said, voice quiet but not unkind. "Hot milk?" Thomas asked, looking up eagerly. The maid shook her head. "Warm enough to fool the tongue." She smiled faintly before hurrying off to another table, her shoes leaving faint, wet prints behind her. Eleanor poured the tea, first weak, amber, more water than leaf. It steamed in the cold air, and for a moment that seemed luxury enough. Clara dipped her spoon into the porridge, blowing gently before tasting it. "It's like paste," she said, wrinkling her nose. "That's because it's good for you," her father replied, managing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Eleanor watched him stir his cup, the spoon clinking softly. He looked tired, the kind of tired that no sleep could cure, a weariness that came from years of calculation and worry, of being the one who must always decide. She wondered if he ever thought of the days before London, before his life had turned to ledgers and soot. There had been a time, she remembered, when his hands smelled of ink and pine, when he'd written her letters from the university filled with hope and foolish plans. She wondered if he remembered that too. A man at the next table coughed violently, the sound echoing like a cannon in the quiet. His wife pressed a handkerchief to his mouth, her eyes darting nervously to the others. The cough subsided, but unease lingered like smoke. Clara reached for her mother's hand beneath the table, and Eleanor squeezed it gently. "It's only the cold," she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. The sound was hollow, mournful, as if the storm itself were whispering through the glass. Eleanor could see the station across the square, its platform glistening with ice. A few figures moved there, small and determined, their scarves trailing behind them like banners. The maid returned with a fresh pot of tea and a plate of coarse bread. "Trains are running again," she said, setting it down. "But slow. The rails'll freeze if they're not careful." Mr. Whitby nodded. "Then we'd best be on one, before they stop again." They ate in silence after that, each mouthful tasting faintly of ash. Thomas scraped his spoon along the bowl until the sound became unbearable. Eleanor covered his hand with her own. "Enough, love," she whispered. When they rose to leave, the maid appeared once more with their bill, her fingers red from the cold. "Safe travels," she said, her eyes flicking briefly toward the children. Outside, the wind bit harder. Snow blew sideways across the square, erasing footprints as quickly as they were made. Mr. Whitby led the way, the children following close behind, their breath rising in small clouds. Eleanor lingered a moment by the hotel door, glancing back at the dim dining room, the grey light, the empty bowls, the faint smell of soot that clung to everything. As the door shut behind her, she felt the cold strike her face like a baptism. Ahead lay the station, and beyond it, the long road north. Behind her, the hotel faded into shadow, a house of ash and hunger that would soon forget they'd ever passed through. She tightened her scarf, took Clara's hand, and stepped forward into the snow. The bells had stopped ringing now, and only the sound of boots against ice remained, the slow, steady rhythm of a family still moving toward warmth they had yet to find. By the time they reached the station, the storm had softened to a gentle drift. Snowflakes moved like falling dust, slow and deliberate, each one distinct against the dim light of morning. The world seemed caught in that half moment between waking and memory, the streets nearly empty, the shops shuttered, even the river muffled under a film of white. Steam rose from the train yard in long, ghostly ribbons, and beneath it all came the steady rhythm of men working, their shouts low, their figures dark silhouettes in the haze. Eleanor led the children toward the waiting room while Mr. Whitby went to purchase their tickets. The porter, from the night before, the one with the crooked cap and the perpetual half-smile, recognized them at once. "You're the family bound for Whitby, aren't you?" he said, tipping his hat. "You've luck enough. The noon train's running after all. Weather's bad north of Scarborough, but they'll chance it." "Thank you," she said. "You've been very kind." He shrugged, his breath fogging in the air. "Kindness is only borrowed, miss. Someone showed me some once, long ago. I just try to return it where I can." Inside, the waiting room was warmer than she expected. The fire there was small but real, its light casting a faint amber glow over the wooden benches. Travellers huddled near it, drying gloves and boots, their faces soft with fatigue. A mother rocked her infant near the hearth, humming a song so quietly it seemed to come from the walls themselves. The smell of wet wool filled the air, heavy, human, familiar. Eleanor guided Clara to a seat by the window, brushing the snow from her coat. Thomas wandered toward the fire, his small hands held out to catch the warmth. Beside him, an elderly woman sat knitting, her needles clicking in time with the slow ticking of the clock above the door. Her scarf was the color of storm clouds, her skin pale as wax. She smiled at the boy when he approached. "Careful, young sir," she said gently. "The fire bites if you get too close." Thomas drew back at once, cheeks pink. "Thank you, ma'am." The woman's eyes twinkled. "A polite child," she said approvingly. "Not many left like that. The world's rushing too fast these days." Her voice carried the faint tremor of someone who'd lived through more winters than she could count. "You're traveling far?" "North," he said proudly. "To see grandmother." "Ah," she murmured. "That's worth any journey. Take this, then." She reached into her knitting basket and drew out a pair of small mittens, grey, lined with soft fleece, barely used. "My grandson outgrew them before the winter came. Yours may as well have them now." Eleanor started to protest, but the woman waved her off. "Don't argue, dear. Wool's only warm when it's worn." Thomas slipped them on, beaming. "They fit perfectly." The woman nodded. Then they were meant for. Moments later, the station bell rang a low, rolling sound that filled the room like the voice of the sea. Passengers gathered their things, murmuring to one another as the porter's whistle cut through the air. Mr. Whitby returned, tickets in hand. "It's time," he said simply. Eleanor turned to the old woman to thank her, but the seat beside the fire was already empty. Only a few strands of grey yarn remained, tangled near the basket. She hesitated, scanning the room, but there was no trace of the woman at all. The train waited outside, breath steaming like a great animal ready to move. As they stepped onto the platform, Thomas looked down at his mittens and smiled. "She said they were meant for me," he whispered. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter, glancing once more at the glowing windows of the waiting room. For an instant, she thought she saw a figure there, just a shadow, faint and still before the door swung shut and the train whistle drowned out everything else. When the carriage lurched forward, the town of York began to fade into white once more, and Eleanor found herself thinking not of the miles ahead, but of the warmth a stranger had left behind, small, quiet, and perfectly fitted to the cold. The train had been moving for nearly an hour when the conductor's voice echoed faintly down the corridor. "Crossing the O's viaduct, hold steady, folks." His warning was unnecessary. The air itself had changed, thinning with height and cold. Conversation died away. Even the children, sensing something vast and invisible beneath them, pressed closer to their parents. Through the frost-flecked window, the landscape had opened wide again. Gone were the clustered houses and hedgerows. Now there was only white upon white fields buried to their fences. Trees bowed like supplicants under snow. Then, as the train began its slow ascent, the ground simply fell away. The viaduct stretched ahead, narrow and impossibly high, its iron ribs gleaming under a sky that looked too fragile to hold the weight of anything living. Eleanor's breath fogged the glass. She could see nothing below, only the suggestion of movement, dark water far beneath, sliding silently between its frozen banks. It was the River Ouse, she knew, but it might just as well have been a vein through the body of the world, carrying winter itself. Clara's hand found hers. "Are we flying, Mama?" "Almost," Eleanor whispered, tightening her grip. Mr. Whitby leaned forward, his face pale in the dim light. "No one speaks above a whisper on bridges," he said softly, half to himself. "Even the wind listens." The bridge groaned under the train's weight, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to rise through their bones. Iron against ice, wheel against rail, it was both terrifying and beautiful, the kind of sound that reminded one how small a human life truly was. Each gust of wind struck the carriage with a low moan, setting the glass trembling in its frame. The lamp above them flickered, casting the passengers in alternating gold and shadow. Thomas could not look away. "It's endless," he breathed. His reflection stared back at him in the dark pane, a ghost layered over the plain. Moving world. Does the river ever freeze all the way? "Sometimes," his father answered, "but not this year. The current runs strong beneath, too strong to stop." The words lingered in Eleanor's mind long after he spoke them. Too strong to stop, She thought of her own life, then the years in London, the long routine of soot and exhaustion, the endless current that carried them forward without asking. How easily they had all mistaken movement for progress, survival for peace. Halfway across, the train slowed. The whistle sounded once, long and mournful, echoing over the frozen valley. For a moment, everything seemed to hang suspended: the bridge, the river, the world itself. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, not from fear but from awe. The cold was absolute here, alive and humming in her lungs. Beneath them, the river gleamed faintly through breaks in the ice, black and restless as thought. And then, as if exhaling, the train began to move again. Slowly at first, then with renewed strength, the wheels clattered forward. The iron sang beneath them, low, rhythmic, almost triumphant. Thomas laughed, the sound sharp and bright against the wind. Clara joined him, her giggle small but fierce, a defiance offered to the cold. When the wheels finally found earth again, a quiet murmur rippled through the passengers. Someone applauded softly. Someone else crossed themselves. The air inside seemed to warm, though no one had added coal to the stove. Eleanor looked once more out the window. Behind them, the bridge arched over the valley like a spine of light, disappearing into the snow. Ahead, the tracks curved north, cutting through white hills that seemed untouched by time. She rested her palm on the glass, tracing the fog of her own breath until it vanished. Mr. Whitby reached for her hand, not out of fear, not even out of habit, but because he wanted to. Their fingers intertwined, rough and cold and human. The whistle blew again, sharper this time, and the train pushed onward. The bridge fell away behind them, swallowed by distance and mist, but its echo lingered, a soft hum beneath their ribs, as if the iron itself remembered their passing. As the train wound deeper into the countryside, the light outside grew dim and brittle. The sun, already weak, clung low on the horizon like a dying ember, struggling against the encroaching grey. Inside the carriage, the passengers had grown quiet again, lulled by the rhythm of the wheels and the long, slow breathing of the engine. Only the hiss of steam and the occasional creak of wood broke the silence. Thomas sat by the window, his small face pale in the cold light. Since crossing the viaduct, he hadn't spoken a word, not to his sister, not to his parents. He watched the world go by with a stillness that felt too heavy for a child. Each time the whistle blew, he flinched, not visibly, but in some inward way, as though the sound struck him somewhere words couldn't reach. Clara noticed first. "Mama," she whispered, tugging at Eleanor's sleeve. "He's gone quiet again." Eleanor glanced at her son. "He's only tired, love. It's been a long morning." But she wasn't certain. Thomas's eyes didn't look tired, they looked far away, fixed on something only he could see. His hands rested on his knees, still and small, his fingers curled around the wooden soldier he always carried. The paint had rubbed off in places, leaving pale patches where the color used to be. He traced the toy's face with his thumb, again and again, as if reminding himself that it was still there, still whole. Mr. Whitby lowered his paper. "You all right, lad?" Thomas didn't answer. The paper rustled softly as his father folded it and set it aside. "He'll find his tongue soon enough," he said, forcing a smile. But Eleanor could hear the worry beneath his calm. The landscape outside had changed. Hills rose on either side now, the snow deeper, the trees fewer. Every so often, they passed a farmhouse or a cluster of cottages, each one half buried, smoke curling weakly from their chimneys. The world looked hushed, sealed in glass. When the train slowed at a small country station, a place so small it seemed more like a memory than a town, the door opened briefly to admit a rush of cold air and a handful of new passengers. Among them was an old priest in a threadbare cassock, his breath clouding in the chill. He took the seat across from Thomas, nodding politely to the family before clasping his hands over his knees. The boy turned his gaze from the window to the man. For the first time since the viaduct, his eyes were alive with something: curiosity, perhaps, or recognition. The priest smiled. "Long journey, eh?" You'll be tired before you reach the coast." Thomas didn't reply, only stared. The priest's smile softened. "Ah," he said quietly. "You're a listener, then. The world needs more of those." Eleanor's chest eased slightly at the gentleness in his tone. She poured tea from the small flask she carried, offering a cup to her husband, then to the priest, who shook his head. "No, thank you, my dear. I've had enough warmth in this life." The train lurched forward again. The sound of the rails returned, steady and endless. The priest looked out the window and began to hum a low tune, wordless but comforting, something like a lullaby. It filled the space between them without demanding anything. After several minutes, Thomas spoke so softly Eleanor almost missed it. "That song," he said. "Where did you learn it?" The priest turned, eyes kind. "It's an old hymn from the sea. Sailors used to sing it when the fog was thick and the stars were gone. Said it helped them find their way." Thomas nodded once, then returned his gaze to the window. His lips moved silently, shaping the melody. Eleanor felt her eyes sting with relief, with love, with something deeper she couldn't quite name. When the priest disembarked at the next stop, he left a faint scent of cedar and candle wax behind him. Thomas watched him go without a word, then tucked the soldier into his coat pocket. He said, "Sailors sing it," he whispered, almost to himself. Eleanor smiled and brushed his hair back. "Then sing it quietly, love. We'll need it to find our way too." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, thick, and endless. The train pressed on through the whiteness, its passengers swaying gently in time, and though no one else could hear it, a faint tune drifted through the carriage, humming low in the boy's throat, a promise of sound returning to silence, of warmth hidden in the cold. The afternoon dimmed into that strange, colorless hour when the world seems caught between waking and sleep. Snow fell again, slow, heavy flakes that clung to the carriage windows, blurring everything beyond into moving shadows. The passengers had drawn into themselves, as people often do on long journeys. Some pretended to read, others stared into nothing, and a few simply watched the frost gather, each breath turning to cloud. It was then that the woman in the mourning veil entered. The door slid open with a sharp hiss, and she appeared like a ghost born from the snow, tall, thin, draped entirely in black. Her veil was long, the kind worn not for fashion but for grief, its gauze falling past her shoulders and brushing against the front of her coat. The only color on her was the dull glint of a silver brooch fastened at her throat, shaped like a small dove mid-flight. She paused in the doorway, searching for a seat. Mr. Whitby rose at once, ever the gentleman. "Madam," he said softly, gesturing to the bench opposite their own. "Please." The woman inclined her head in thanks and took the place beside the window. The movement stirred a faint scent, lavender water, fading but clean. She sat very still, gloved hands folded atop a small black case. For a long while, no one spoke. Only the sound of the train filled the air, the steady clatter of metal, the breath of the engine echoing through the corridor. Clara peeked up at her, whispering to her mother, "Why is she dressed like that?" Eleanor hushed her gently. "Because she's lost someone, darling." The woman must have heard, for her veil shifted slightly. A nod, perhaps, or a tremor. "Yes," she said, her voice low and even. "I have." Her tone carried neither self-pity nor drama, only the weary cadence of truth. She lifted the veil then, just enough to reveal her face, pale, hollow-cheeked, with eyes the color of storm water. "Forgive me," she said. "I didn't mean to intrude on your comfort." "You're no intrusion," Eleanor said. "Travel's kinder with company." The woman's gaze drifted toward the window. "Kinder," she repeated softly. "I suppose it is." The train passed through a tunnel, plunging them into sudden darkness. For a moment, the world vanished. Only breath and memory remained. When the light returned, the woman was still staring outside, though there was nothing to see but her own reflection. "My husband was a sailor," she said at last, speaking to the glass. "He was lost 2 winters ago, off Whitby coast. They found the wreckage in spring, his pocket watch, his wedding band, but never him. I take this train every December. I suppose I hope, foolishly, to see something I missed before. No one replied. What answer could there be? The sound of the rails grew louder, as if the train itself knew to fill the silence left by grief. Thomas looked up from his toy soldier. "The sea keeps secrets," he said quietly. The woman turned her eyes toward him, and something in her expression softened, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. "Yes," she said, "it does. And sometimes mercy hides among them." For the rest of the journey they spoke little. The carriage was warm now, the air thick with the scent of coal and wool. Yet the presence of the veiled woman made it feel sacred, as though her sorrow carried its own light, small but enduring. When the train stopped briefly at Scarborough, she gathered her case and rose. "This is where I leave you," she said, drawing the veil down again. "Safe travels. May your hearts stay warm, no matter the weather." Eleanor stood to wish her well, but the woman had already stepped into the snow. Through the window, they watched her cross the platform, a lone black figure against a white world. A porter moved to assist her, but she waved him off gently and continued on, vanishing into the drifting light. For a long time afterward, the Whitbys sat in silence. Clara leaned her head on her mother's arm, whispering. She looked like a shadow walking home. Eleanor stroked her hair. Perhaps she was love, but some shadows still carry love with them. The train began to move again, slowly, the whistle cutting through the snow like a cry across the sea. And though the woman was gone, her faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, delicate, haunting, a memory wrapped in black silk. By the time they left Scarborough behind, the world outside had vanished beneath a storm so thick it seemed the sky itself had come undone. The train pushed forward through white silence, its whistle echoing across a landscape it could no longer see. The windows were rimmed in frost, each pane a dull mirror that caught only the reflection of the passengers within their faces, pale, their breath fogging the glass. Beyond that, nothing. No horizon, no fields, no stars. Only snow, falling endlessly. Inside the compartment, the children whispered to each other in the hush of it. Thomas had grown solemn again, tracing shapes on the window with his gloved finger circles, loops, the outline of something that might have been a sun. Clara hummed softly under her breath, a tune without beginning or end, like the motion of the train itself. Eleanor sat between them, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The letter from her mother was there, safe in her coat pocket, though she had not read it again since London. It was enough just to know it was close, a promise waiting for her at the journey's end. She could not shake the memory of the woman in the mourning veil, nor the way she had said, "I take this train every December." There had been something eternal in that voice, as if grief itself had learned to travel. Mr. Whitby leaned his head against the cold glass, eyes closed. He had not spoken for some time, content to let the storm do the talking. It roared faintly outside, a sound like distant surf. Every so often, the train shuddered, wheels slipping, steam hissing, then steadied again, driven forward by the sheer will of machinery. At one point, the conductor passed through the carriage, lantern in hand. His face was pale with cold, his eyelashes clumped with frost. "We'll slow through the moors," he said to no one in particular. "Drifts are near 5 feet deep in places. If the wind picks up, we'll stop till it clears." Eleanor met his eyes briefly. There was no fear in his expression, only the dull patience of a man who had seen too many winters to be surprised by one more. She nodded in silent thanks, and he moved on, his boots leaving a trail of snow that melted quickly on the floorboards. The storm thickened still. The light from the lamps dimmed as snow pressed against the windows, turning the glass milky white. For a strange moment, it felt as though they were no longer moving at all, suspended in some pocket of time where nothing existed but the sound of breath and the faint vibration of iron beneath their feet. Clara lifted her head. "Mama," she said softly, "what if it never stops snowing?" Eleanor smoothed her hair, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "Then we'll build a fire wherever we stop," she said, "and wait for spring to find us." "But what if spring forgets?" Eleanor hesitated, then smiled faintly. "It never forgets. It just takes the long road sometimes." Thomas turned from the window. "It looks like we're inside a cloud," he said. "Maybe heaven is like this." Mr. Whitby opened his eyes at that, looking at his son. "If heaven feels this cold, I'll need a better coat," he murmured. The line made both children laugh, a small, bright sound that seemed to warm the carriage for a moment. Outside, the wind howled against the metal, rattling the walls like a voice demanding to be heard. But the train did not stop. It kept pressing forward, steady and stubborn, its heart of fire fighting the cold that tried to swallow it whole. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, it was impossible to tell. The world had become a single, endless color, and time itself seemed to dissolve in it. Eleanor leaned her head against the seat, listening to the quiet breathing of her family, the soft crack of ice along the windows, and the steady pulse of the train beneath them, one heartbeat against the frozen world. The snow kept falling, thick and endless, like history itself repeating what it could not forget. And somewhere ahead, unseen, waiting, lay the first faint glimmer of light on the horizon, the promise that even the longest winter must, at last, remember how to end. It happened just after dusk, when the world was reduced to sound and shadow. The train had been struggling against the storm for hours, the rhythm of its wheels uneven, its breath of steam coming slower, more labored. The passengers had stopped pretending to read or talk. They sat in a silence that deepened with every mile, aware of the machine beneath them beginning to tire like an animal pushed too far. Then came the stutter, a lurch forward, a sudden grind of iron. The whistle blew once sharp, urgent, before the train shuddered and began to slow. The sound of the engine filled the air, then broke apart into coughing bursts of steam. And finally, with a low groan that seemed almost human, the great machine gave up. The motion ceased. The world stilled. At first, no one spoke. The passengers sat frozen, waiting for the familiar rhythm to return, for the wheels to catch again. But the silence lengthened, heavy and absolute. Then came the hiss of pressure escaping from the rappels, engine a long exhale, weary and final. The train was dead in the snow. Eleanor felt the quiet like a physical thing pressing against her chest. Clara stirred beside her, half asleep. "Are we there?" she murmured. "Not yet," Eleanor whispered, brushing a lock of hair from her daughter's face. "Go back to dreaming." Thomas sat upright, wide-eyed. "What's happened?" Mr. Whitby stood, steadying himself against the door frame as the carriage shifted slightly in the wind. "The engines failed," he said quietly. "We'll wait. They'll fix it." But even as he said it, doubt edged his voice. Through the window, they could see only darkness. The snowstorm had swallowed the world whole. No lamps shone ahead or behind. The carriages seemed to float in a void of white. When he wiped the fog from the glass, the frost reformed instantly. The cold was tightening its grip. The conductor passed through minutes later, his lantern swinging. "Boiler froze," he announced grimly. "We're between Whitwell and Pickering. Linesmen are working to thaw the valves. Could be an hour, could be 3. A murmur swept through the compartment, not panic, just resignation. People nodded, adjusted their coats, pulled scarves tighter. This was the Victorian way of disaster, quiet endurance. No one complained, because complaining would not move the train. The stove at the end of the carriage burned low, its light a weak pulse. The air grew colder with each breath. Frost began to form on the inside of the windows, crawling in delicate white veins across the glass. Clara tucked her hands beneath her mother's shawl. Eleanor felt her fingers trembling. "I'll speak with the guard," Mr. Whitby said. "See if there's more coal to stoke the fire." He buttoned his coat and stepped into the corridor. The door closed behind him with a sigh, leaving the compartment in near silence, except for the wind's moan against the walls. Minutes stretched. Outside, Voices echoed faintly, men calling to one another, boots crunching through snow, metal clanging against metal. Somewhere far ahead, a burst of orange light flared, the glow of a torch cutting briefly through the dark. Then it was gone. Eleanor drew the children close. "It's all right," she whispered, though her own breath trembled. "The men will fix it." Thomas tilted his head toward the window. "It sounds like the wind's talking." "It does," she said softly. "It's just telling us to wait." When Mr. Whitby returned, his face was pale, his beard flecked with frost. "They're thawing the valves with oil-soaked rags," he said. "If the pressure builds again, we'll move. Until then," he gestured to the stove, "we keep close." He lifted Clara from the seat and wrapped his coat around her. Eleanor took Thomas's hands, rubbing warmth into them. The three huddled together, the faint orange glow of the stove casting their shadows long and wavering on the walls. Outside, the storm howled louder. The train stood helpless, its black body vanishing beneath layers of white. The world around them had ceased to move, yet time pressed on in its slow, invisible way, measured now not by clocks, but by the fading heat of a dying fire. In the distance, a bell rang once, twice from somewhere along the line. It was not a signal, but a warning, a sound carried through wind and cold to remind them that others too were waiting in the dark. Eleanor closed her eyes and listened. The engine might sleep, but the world had not stopped. Beneath the frozen earth, rivers still moved unseen. Somewhere far ahead, dawn was already forming behind the clouds. For now, they waited suspended between motion and stillness, between what had broken and what would soon begin again. The storm did not ease. It deepened. Hours slipped by, measured only by the crack of wind and the faint groan of the train's hull shifting beneath its burden of snow. Somewhere ahead, men worked in the darkness with torches, their shouts thin as thread in the distance. The passengers, trapped in their compartments, could see only shadows through the glass, small, flickering shapes, moving like fireflies lost inside the storm. Eleanor pressed her palm against the window, trying to see. The cold bit instantly through her glove. Outside, flakes swirled past in waves, catching the light of the torches as they fell. The glow wavered, disappeared, then returned, an erratic constellation of lanterns scattered across the white world. "They're still working," she whispered, half to reassure the children, half to convince herself. Thomas, wrapped in his father's scarf, peered over the edge of the seat. "Do you think they'll dig us out?" "They will," Mr. Whitby said, though his voice carried the slow weariness of a man forcing faith into form. "They always do." The lamp above them had nearly burned out. Its wick hissed faintly in the chill, the light dimming until everything took on the color of copper and shadow. The stove had long gone cold. Frost had crept up the window frame, blooming into white crystals that glimmered faintly whenever a lantern passed outside. Eleanor rubbed her hands together until the skin ached. The door slid open, and the conductor stepped inside. His coat was crusted with ice, his lantern glowing like an ember against the dark. "Boiler's near thawed," he said, "but the drifts are high ahead. Might be a few more hours before we move. Best to keep close, folks." His breath curled in the light as he spoke, leaving a cloud that hung for a moment before dissolving. He noticed the children huddled together and reached into his pocket, pulling out 2 small lumps wrapped in paper. "Sugar lumps," he said, with a bend. "Wink. For courage." Thomas took his with solemn care, as though accepting a medal. Clara smiled faintly, her cheeks red from the cold. "Thank you, sir." The man nodded. "Keep them till morning. The first bite always tastes better with daylight." Then he was gone again, the sound of the door closing swallowed by the wind. The lanterns outside had multiplied. There must have been a dozen now, bobbing through the drifts like souls carrying their own light through purgatory. The workers moved in rhythm, dig, heave, rest, their silhouettes haloed in the storm. Occasionally one would lift his lamp high, signaling to another, and the light would flare briefly across the train's side, illuminating faces pressed to the glass. Eleanor watched, mesmerized. The flicker of each lantern felt like a heartbeat against the dark. Each one seemed to say, "We are still here, we are still moving, even when nothing else can." Mr. Whitby broke the silence. "I remember my father telling me about the blizzard of '61, he said quietly. "Trains buried for days. They'd light lanterns on every carriage roof so rescuers could see them through the night." He paused, his eyes on the drifting glow beyond the window. "Sometimes," he said, "you could look out over the moors and see miles of lights burning through the snow like stars that had fallen and refused to die." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Then perhaps we're one of those stars tonight." He reached across and took her hand. "Perhaps we are." Outside, the wind began to soften. The howling became a hum, the snow falling in slower spirals now. One by one, the lanterns drew nearer to the engine. The workers moved in a final burst of energy shovels, scraping, metal striking metal, until at last a low rumble rose from the front of the train. Steam hissed, sputtered, and then steadied. The whistle sounded, faint but clear. Clara gasped, clutching her mother's sleeve. "It's waking up!" Eleanor smiled, the relief sharp enough to bring tears. "Yes, love, it's waking." The lanterns began to lift one by one, carried back toward the front of the train. In their glow, the snow looked blue and endless. But the track beneath was visible now, a thin, black line cutting through the white. The world seemed to breathe again. Moments later, with a low shudder, the engine exhaled a plume of steam. The wheels turned once, then again. The lanterns bobbed and flared as the train inched forward through the drift, finding its way back into motion. The passengers cheered softly, a sound of wonder more than joy. And as the train crawled onward through the dim blue night, the lanterns behind them grew smaller, each flame flickering until it became nothing more than a pinprick of gold swallowed by snow. Eleanor leaned her head against the glass and whispered, "Thank you." Whether she meant the workers or the storm, even she could not tell. But outside, the lights answered, glowing once more before fading into the night as though the world had heard her and nodded back. The train crawled onward through the moors, its wheels protesting in slow, uneven rhythm. Steam rolled past the windows in sighing clouds, mingling with the snowfall until neither seemed real. The storm had quieted to a whisper now, the wind spent and heavy. For the first time in hours, the passengers could hear beyond the machine the small, human sounds that proved they were still alive. A cough, a shifting coat, the faint clink of a cup rolling on the floor. Then came something else. At first, Eleanor thought it was the echo of the wheels on the rails, distorted by fatigue and imagination. But soon she realized it was different, softer, steadier, and unmistakably human. A voice. It rose from somewhere outside, carried by the wind in long, wavering notes. It was not a shout or a call for help. It was a melody, low, mournful, and hauntingly beautiful, winding its way through the cold like a thread of warmth. Eleanor straightened. "Do you hear that?" Mr. Whitby tilted his head, listening. "It can't be. Singing." Clara, already awake again, pressed her face to the glass. "Who would sing out here?" she whispered. "There's no one but snow." But the sound persisted. It drifted across the moors in the pauses between the engine's groans, a voice deep and old, singing words too blurred by distance to understand. Other passengers heard it too. The silence in the carriage deepened. People leaned forward, breath held, as though afraid to interrupt the fragile miracle of it. The conductor appeared in the corridor, lantern in hand, his brow furrowed. "It's the workers," he said quietly. "They sing to keep time when the wind's too strong to hear one another." "Songs in this weather?" a man asked from another compartment. The conductor nodded. "Always songs. When the world goes white, you mark your rhythm in music, or you lose it in the storm." He moved on, leaving the door ajar, and the sound grew clearer. The melody swelled no longer one voice, but several. Deep, resonant tones carried by men unseen, shaping the air into something both sacred and practical. The rhythm matched their labor. Shovel, lift, throw. a harmony against the cold. Thomas climbed onto the seat to listen better, his breath misting the glass. "It sounds like church," he whispered. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Maybe it is a church without walls." The song wove through the night, rising and falling with the tempo of their work. It had no words she could discern, only long vowels that rolled like waves and ended in soft, human sighs. It was a song older than grief, older than hope, the kind of sound people make when they need to remind the dark that they are still here. Even Mr. Whitby, who rarely gave sentiment much room, bowed his head. "I'd forgotten how men used to sing like that," he murmured. "My father said it kept the cold from climbing inside your bones." Eleanor felt it too, the warmth it brought, invisible but real. Each note seemed to press back against the night, filling the hollow spaces between heartbeats. The tune shifted once, higher now, almost joyful, as if the workers below the window sensed that the hardest part was over. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it faded. The last verse hung on the air for a moment, then drifted away into the snow. Only the steady pulse of the train remained. No one spoke. No one wanted to break what lingered, that strange, gentle quiet after beauty has passed. Clara rested her head on her mother's shoulder. Thomas sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap. "At last," Eleanor whispered, "they've given us their warmth." Mr. Whitby nodded, his eyes fixed on the fading glow of the lanterns outside. "And they've taken a bit of our silence in return." The whistle blew once soft, restrained as though the engine itself paid its respects. And as the train moved northward again, the sound of the song seemed to cease, follow them, faint and eternal, carried on the wind like a prayer too old for words, a reminder that even in the deepest cold, the human voice still finds its way home. Not long after the singing faded, the train slowed again, this time with intention. There was no jolt or panic, just a long sigh from the engine and the gentle squeal of the brakes as it came to rest beside a signal cabin that stood alone in the white vastness. It was a small thing, barely more than a wooden hut, half buried in snow, a single plume of smoke curling from its chimney like a fragile thread of life. The light from its window glowed amber against the blue dusk, the kind of warmth that seemed to promise shelter, even to those who'd never stepped inside. The conductor passed through the carriage once more. "We'll pause here till the line ahead clears," he said, breath fogging as he spoke. "Signalman's got a fire going. Those with little ones may stretch their legs, but stay near the train. The moors swallow sound and sight both." Eleanor gathered her shawl and looked at her husband. "Let's take them out for a few minutes. They need to feel the ground." Again, Mr. Whitby nodded, though his expression was wary. 5 minutes, no more. They stepped down into the snow, boots sinking deep, the air biting at every exposed inch of skin. The silence outside was immense. The storm had passed, leaving the landscape blank and endless, a white sea stretching in all directions. The only movement came from the drifting steam of the train and the soft fall of loose flakes shaken from the sky. Thomas immediately began to stamp patterns into the snow, his laughter sharp and bright in the stillness. Clara followed, holding her mother's hand, her cheeks pink from the cold. Their footprints looked like small, dark petals scattered over the field of white. The signalman opened his cabin door and waved them over. He was a stout man, middle-aged, with a face ruddy from years of frost and firelight. Come in," he called. "You'll freeze your noses clean off out there." Inside, the air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and old wood. A fire burned fiercely in a small cast-iron stove, its glow licking across the walls. Maps, ledgers, and signal charts hung from hooks, each curling at the edges from years of heat and soot. The room was barely large enough for a table, 2 stools, and the stove, but to Eleanor, it felt like stepping into another world. The man shut the door quickly, sealing out the cold. "Name's Alden," he said, rubbing his hands together. "Been keeping this stretch of track near on 20 years. Don't get many visitors except when Winter decides to make herself queen again." Thomas stared at the instruments, the levers, the lanterns, the brass whistle on the table. "Do you live here all the time?" he asked. Alden chuckled. "Aye. Somebody has to watch the rails, or the world stops turning." He poured hot tea from a dented kettle into tin cups and handed them around. "No milk, no sugar, but it'll do the job." Eleanor accepted hers gratefully. The warmth of the cup stung her fingers before sinking deep into them. For the first time that day, she felt thawed from within. Clara leaned near the stove, eyes wide at the crackle of the coals. "Doesn't it get lonely here?" she asked. Alden looked into the fire for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes, but loneliness isn't the worst thing. You start to learn the language of the wind. She tells you what's coming before men ever could." He turned, smiling softly. "Right now she's saying the line will clear by dawn." They lingered in the cabin longer than they intended, lulled by the warmth and the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. When at last they stepped back outside, night had fully descended, a dome of dark blue scattered with faint stars. The snow beneath their boots glittered like glass dust. From the train, a whistle blew twice, calling them home. Alden waved as they left, his shadow long against the cabin door. "Safe travels now," he called. "Keep your lamps trimmed and your hearts the same." As the family climbed back into their compartment, the warmth of the cabin seemed to cling to them, faint but real. Eleanor looked out the window one last time. The small wooden hut stood alone in the darkness, its light burning steady as a promise. When the train began to move again, its smoke coiled upward, merging with the chimney's plume, until neither could be told apart. Fire meeting fire, warmth meeting warmth, and for the first time that night, the endless moors no longer felt empty at all. By the time they left the cabin behind, night had closed in completely. The sky was a deep indigo, streaked with pale clouds that glowed faintly with snowlight. Inside the carriage, the children had fallen quiet again, lulled by the rhythm of the wheels. The stove had been relit, but the warmth it gave was thin and uneven, fading before it reached their feet. Eleanor could feel the cold settling into the seams of the compartment, creeping under coats and collars like an uninvited guest. Clara had drifted to sleep almost instantly, her head against her mother's shoulder. Thomas, however, had grown restless. He shifted beneath his blanket, his breath uneven. At first, Eleanor thought he was only overtired, but when she touched his hand, she froze. His skin burned hot against her cold fingers. "Henry," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "He's warm, too warm." Mr. Whitby leaned forward, brow furrowing. He pressed the back of his hand to the boy's cheek, then his forehead. "It's fever," he said quietly, though his tone carried something sharper fear trying to sound calm. "The air's too cold, and he hasn't eaten enough. It's exhaustion, nothing more." But Eleanor saw the tightness in his jaw as he spoke. She knew better than to believe it. Thomas stirred, his voice faint. "Mama, I'm here, love," she said, pulling the blanket closer around him. "Just rest. We're nearly home." He shivered, then curled into himself, the toy soldier still clutched in his small hand. His eyes fluttered, but did not open. Eleanor pressed her palm to his forehead again, and for a moment her breath caught. The heat was fierce, unnatural, as if his body were trying to burn the cold out from within. The train rocked gently, its motion now cruelly soothing, as though the world continued indifferent to a mother's panic. Outside, snow whirled in soft spirals against the glass. The window glowed faintly from the lantern outside, their compartment, but beyond that light was only shadow. Mr. Whitby reached for their satchel. "There's water left," he said, pulling out a flask. He soaked a handkerchief and passed it to her. Eleanor laid it across the boy's brow, her hands trembling. "When we stop next, we'll find a doctor." "When we stop next," she echoed, her voice distant. The words sounded fragile, like glass pressed too hard. The compartment had grown silent except for the faint rattle of the rails. Clara stirred beside her brother but did not wake. Eleanor looked at them both, two small faces, so pale they seemed carved from snow, and something inside her chest ached so fiercely she thought it might crack her ribs. Mr. Whitby tried to meet her eyes, but the guilt there was too heavy. He reached out, brushing her sleeve. "He'll be all right. Children run hot. You remember Clara when she had that cough last winter?" But she wasn't listening. Her attention was fixed on Thomas's breathing, shallow, uneven, a fragile rhythm that seemed to slip each time she began to trust it. Minutes bled into hours. The sound of the storm returned, louder now, battering the sides of the train as though demanding to be let in. Eleanor whispered small prayers into the boy's hair, prayers without words, prayers that belonged to every mother who had ever waited for dawn beside a sickbed. At some point, Thomas began to mumble in his sleep. The words were unclear, but one phrase repeated itself, over and over. The song in the snow. His small hand moved restlessly, clutching the wooden soldier tighter. Eleanor's heart twisted. She smoothed his hair and whispered, "Yes, love. The song's still there. It's just farther away now." The train pressed on through the darkness. Each mile seemed slower than the last, each whistle longer, more distant. The air inside felt thinner with every passing minute. And still she watched through every jolt, every hiss of steam, every trembling flicker of light, waiting for the first sign of change. When it came, it was so small she nearly missed it. The fevered flush in his cheeks had softened, his breathing eased. He slept, finally, not the restless kind of exhaustion, but something gentler. Eleanor didn't dare move. She sat perfectly still, one hand resting on his back, feeling the faint rise and fall. Outside, the snow began again, not the furious storm of before, but a quiet, drifting fall, slow as breath. Mr. Whitby exhaled. "He's resting." Eleanor nodded, her eyes never leaving her son. "Let him dream," she whispered, and for the first time in hours, she leaned back and closed her own eyes, the rhythm of the train carrying her somewhere between prayer and sleep. The fever had not broken completely. She could still feel the heat through the blanket, but the boy's breathing was steady, and for now, that was enough. The whistle sounded again, distant and mournful, echoing across the frozen moors. It was the sound of persistence, of fire surviving in the cold, and though neither of them said it aloud, both parents listened as if the sound itself could guide them safely through the long night ahead. When Eleanor woke, the world outside was still dark, though the sky had paled to the faint grey of dawn just beginning to breathe. The train was moving slower now, almost cautious, as if it too feared disturbing the fragile stillness of morning. Frost had reclaimed the windows overnight, feathering the glass with white patterns so intricate they looked deliberate, like the careful handiwork of angels. Thomas lay against her side, his face soft with sleep. The heat had lessened, but he was still too warm. She touched his forehead with the back of her hand, not burning now, but glowing faintly, like an ember that refused to go out. Clara slept beside him, her small body curled into the hollow of her brother's arm, their breaths rising and falling in quiet synchrony. Eleanor reached for her husband's sleeve. "How long was I asleep?" 2 hours, perhaps 3, Mr. Whitby said quietly. His voice was thick with exhaustion. The line cleared near Pickering. "We should be in Whitby by noon if the tracks hold." Her gaze flickered to the frosted window. "And if they don't?" He didn't answer. The pause said enough. She leaned forward, resting her head briefly in her hands. Her eyes burned with sleeplessness and worry. The smell of smoke hung heavy in the compartment, coal and ash, tinged with something sweet, almost floral. Someone down the carriage must have lit a new fire, and the smoke drifted through the cracks between compartments. To most, it would have smelled of heat and progress. To her, it smelled like confession. Without meaning to, she began to whisper, not loudly, not even audibly, but the rhythm of prayer shaped itself on her lips, the words she'd learned long ago, before London, before the greyness of factories and city soot. Deliver us from the cold, deliver us from the waiting. She didn't know who she was speaking to, God, memory, or the child beside her who hovered somewhere between fever and rest. She prayed the way. One breathes when the air is thin, not because it brings comfort, but because it's the only thing left to do. The whistle blew once, low and distant. The train passed over a bridge, and the sound of the river below reached them faintly, a muted rush, muffled by ice. Eleanor imagined its water moving beneath the frozen skin, unseen but alive, carving its way north like a pulse beneath the earth. She thought of her son's small body fighting the fever in the same quiet way, something deep and unseen, refusing to stop. Mr. Whitby rubbed his hands together, then reached for his wife's. "He'll be all right," he said again. His voice was gentle now, stripped of the certainty he usually carried. "He's strong like you." Eleanor turned to him, her face pale in the dawn's first light. "I don't think strength keeps a child alive," she said softly. "Only grace." The words hung between them, filling the air like the faint haze of smoke. From somewhere near the front of the train came the faint hum of men talking, the guards perhaps, or the engineers tending the firebox. Their voices were too distant to understand, but their tone was calm, normal, life continuing as if nothing extraordinary was happening. That, too, was a kind of grace. Eleanor adjusted the blanket over Thomas's shoulders. He murmured in his sleep, a small sound that could have been pain or a dream. She bent close, whispering words he wouldn't hear but that still needed saying. "Stay with us, love. We're almost there. You're not lost to the cold." Not yet. The light through the window grew stronger, tinting the frost gold at its edges. The smoke that had filled the compartment thinned now, curling upward in pale ribbons. Eleanor followed it with her eyes, the way it drifted upward, how it vanished without resistance. She imagined her prayers following that same path, fragile and invisible, yet somehow rising. By the time the train reached the next bend, Thomas had grown still again. His breathing was steadier, the fever ebbing at last. Eleanor exhaled and closed her eyes, her own shoulders loosening for the first time in what felt like years. Outside, the landscape was shifting. The hills that had been white for days now broke open into valleys brushed with color, a smear of brown heath here, a patch of frozen stream there. The storm had moved south, leaving behind a sky of fractured light. Mr. Whitby leaned his head back against the seat. "The worst has passed," he murmured. Eleanor nodded, eyes on the horizon. "For the train," she said quietly, "perhaps for us too." As the morning sun climbed higher, the smoke from the engine stretched across the pale sky like a black ribbon, a trail of proof that something had survived the night. And in that fragile warmth, Eleanor folded her hands again, this time not in fear but in gratitude, the words of prayer lingering on her tongue long after the sound of the whistle faded into the light. The sun never truly rose that day. It hovered low, pale and weak behind a veil of mist, casting no warmth at all, only the illusion of light. The train had stopped once more by late afternoon, halted on an open stretch of moorland where the snowdrifts were too deep to challenge until the ploughing engine ahead cleared a path. The passengers had been told it would only be an hour's delay, but as the wind picked up again, time began to stretch in the way it does when one is trapped between movement and waiting. Eleanor sat very still, her hands folded over Thomas's blanket. His fever had broken but left him hollowed out, breathing lightly in his sleep, as if the sickness had stolen something that rest could not return. His face was pale, except for the faint blush of his lips, and the soldier toy still rested in his hand, its paint chipped, its head bent forward, as if it too had bowed to exhaustion. The compartment had grown darker with every passing minute. The lamp above them flickered weakly, its fuel nearly gone. A new kind of quiet had settled, not peace, but the stillness that follows fear, when even relief feels too fragile to touch. Clara leaned against her mother's arm. "Why have we stopped again?" she asked softly. "Because the world needs to catch its breath," Eleanor said. The girl thought about that for a moment, then nodded solemnly, as if the answer had satisfied her. Outside, the wind pressed against the carriage like an animal, searching for a way in. It whistled through the seams of the doors, found its way into the cracks beneath the window frame, and curled around their boots. The snow that struck the glass came sideways now, relentless, erasing the world a little more with each gust. Mr. Whitby rose to check on the other passengers. He moved quietly through the corridor, speaking in low tones with the conductor, exchanging nods with the strangers who had become, by necessity, companions in waiting. When he returned, he brushed the frost from his shoulders and sat down beside her. "They've stopped ahead for the night," he said. "No sense in risking the grade near the coast till daylight. We'll move again at dawn." "Dawn," Eleanor repeated. It felt like a faraway word, a promise spoken too early to be believed. The night settled around them with the weight of a thick blanket. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf, or perhaps only the wind's imagination, howled across the moor. The sound stretched, mournful and endless, before dissolving into the storm. Inside the compartment, the fire in the stove had burned itself out entirely. The metal was cold to the touch. The conductor made his rounds with blankets from the baggage car, coarse wool, thin but better than nothing. "We've enough for one each," he said. "Keep your children close. The temperature's dropping fast." Eleanor took the blanket gratefully, wrapping it first around Clara, then herself. The wool smelled, faintly of smoke and old rain. As the hours wore on, the world outside vanished completely. The only light came from the faint red glow of the signal lamp at the front of the train, a single point in an ocean of dark. It flickered through the snow like the heartbeat of something vast and mechanical, the lone sign that life persisted somewhere beyond their window. In the corner of the compartment, an older couple began to hum softly an old hymn, wordless and slow. Others joined in, one by one, until the quiet filled with the low murmur of many voices. It wasn't a song of joy but of endurance, a sound meant to hold back the dark for just a few more hours. Eleanor closed her eyes and let the hum wash over her. The train, for all its weariness, seemed to breathe in rhythm with them. The faint hiss of the pipes, the creak of the wood, the faraway sigh of wind. Thomas stirred once, murmuring something too faint to hear, then went still again. Mr. Whitby reached for her hand, beneath the blanket. His grip was steady, rough from cold, but human alive. "This is the longest night I can remember," he said. Eleanor turned toward him, her face half lit by the lamp's dying glow. "Then morning will be that much brighter." He smiled faintly, though his eyes were tired. Outside, the wind began to slow, its voice softening to a whisper. The snow no longer struck the windows but drifted instead, falling straight and slow, like ash after a fire. And inside that frozen world, on a motionless train stranded between nowhere and home, the Whitbys sat together in the dark, wrapped in the warmth of breath, of touch, of persistence. The night was long, yes, but it was not empty. Somewhere beyond the frost and silence, the first light of morning was already beginning its slow crawl across the horizon. They couldn't see it yet, but they could feel it waiting, steady and patient, at the edge of the world. When the sky at last began to pale, it was not with color, but with the slow lifting of the dark. The storm had quieted in the night, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt sacred, a silence made of snow and breath and things unspoken. The train had not moved for hours, its metal skin sheathed in frost, its great lungs of steam stilled to the faintest whisper. Inside the compartment, the world was a blur of half-sleep. Passengers lay wrapped in their blankets, faces ghostly in the weak dawn light. Even the children had ceased to stir. Eleanor sat awake among them, her eyes raw with exhaustion. Thomas still slept beside her, his fever gone but his skin pale as the snow outside. She had not dared to close her eyes again, since his breathing had steadied. Every rise and fall of his chest was counted, every sigh a small mercy earned from the night. Her husband, though, had given up on sleep of another kind. For the past hour, he had been writing. He sat hunched over his knees, a scrap of paper resting against the back of a ledger, his gloved hand trembling slightly as he wrote. The ink froze as it touched the page, blooming in uneven patches. He wrote slowly, deliberately, as if each word cost him something. Eleanor watched him for a while before finally speaking. "What are you writing?" He didn't look up. "A letter," he said softly. "To whom?" He paused, the pen hovering in midair. "To your mother," he said at last, "though I'll likely never send it." She frowned. "Why not?" He exhaled through his nose, a thin mist escaping his lips. "Because it's not a letter meant to be read." She said nothing, and he continued to write. The scratching of the pen sounded loud in the stillness. She could just make out the words on the page, "My dearest mother, forgive the lateness of this message." He wrote of the journey, of the storm, of how close they'd come to being buried in it. Then the sentences changed. The tone deepened. He wrote of things never spoken aloud, of his regret at the distance between them, of the years spent in London's grey fog, chasing work and respectability while the rest of life slipped quietly by. He wrote of his children, too, of Thomas's bravery, of Clara's laughter, of Eleanor's steady courage. His pen hesitated, then moved again, the words smaller now, more private. "You raised a daughter who still knows how to find light, even when the lamps are gone. I thought you should know that." Eleanor's throat tightened. She turned away, not from him, but from the intimacy of the words, as if they were something fragile that might vanish if looked at directly. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully, pressing the crease with his gloved thumb. He stared at it for a long moment, then slipped it into his coat pocket. "If something had happened last night," he said quietly, "I would have wanted her to know." Eleanor looked down at their sleeping children, the tiny rise and fall of their chests. "Something did happen," she whispered. "We lived." The words hung in the cold air like the breath of a prayer. He reached for her hand then, fingers cold but steady. "Then perhaps that's the letter I should have written," he said. "Just that one word." "Which one?" He met her eyes. "Lived." For a long time, they said nothing. The train creaked softly around them, adjusting to the warmth of a slow dawn. Outside, the snow shone pale gold where the first light touched it. In the far distance, the faint cry of a crow echoed, the only living sound for miles. Eleanor leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, the paper crinkling faintly in his pocket. "You should send it anyway," she murmured. "Not for her, perhaps, but for you." He smiled, though his eyes remained distant. "Maybe," he said, "when the line runs again." The whistle blew, then a long, low sound that rolled across the frozen land like a sigh. The engine was stirring to life once more, its breath rising in white plumes against the dawn. Eleanor closed her eyes. The rails beneath them trembled, the familiar rhythm of motion returning fragile, hesitant, alive. The letter, unsent and unseen, rested close to her husband's heart as the train crept forward again, carrying its passengers out of the night and into a morning that felt like forgiveness. When movement returned, it came softly, the faint shudder of the wheels, the low groan of the couplings, the sigh of the engine breathing again. The sound was slow at first, uncertain, like a heart relearning its rhythm after being still too long. Then, inch by inch, the train began to crawl forward through the last of the drifts. Outside, dawn had at last taken hold of the horizon. It was not a brilliant sunrise, no gold, no pink, no blaze of color, but a muted awakening. The world unfolded in shades of pearl and ash, every surface softened beneath a skin of frost. The snow had stopped falling, though flakes still drifted from the trees like lost feathers when the wind moved. The fields stretched unbroken in every direction, glimmering faintly beneath the light, and in that fragile glow, the world seemed almost new again. Eleanor pressed her hand against the window, watching the landscape slip by. The frost on the glass had melted at last, and her reflection looked strange to her, pale, hollow-eyed, but alive. She could see Thomas beside her, his small head resting against the seat, his lashes fluttering as he drifted between sleep and waking. The fever had gone. He was cool now, damp with sweat, and his breathing even. Every few minutes, his hand twitched as if chasing dreams, but the terrible stillness of the night before had passed. Clara was awake already, whispering softly to her father. Her voice, though quiet, carried a note of wonder. "Look, Papa, it's shining." Mr. Whitby leaned toward the window. "So it is," he murmured. "A new world, all scrubbed clean." The remark carried a weight none of them mentioned. They passed through a valley where the snow lay deep between the hills. Smoke rose from a distant farmhouse, thin, grey ribbons twisting upward until they vanished into the pale morning. A dog barked somewhere unseen, the sound sharp and lonely. The river that ran beside the tracks was half frozen, its surface glimmering like glass. Here and there, black water moved beneath the ice, slow, dark, patient. The whistle sounded, and its echo rolled over the fields like a benediction. Eleanor leaned forward, her hand resting lightly on her son's hair. "He'll be hungry when he wakes," she said, her voice trembling with something that wasn't quite laughter. Mr. Whitby nodded. "And there'll be food waiting at the hall. Your mother will have the kitchen blazing before we even arrive." She smiled faintly. "If she's strong enough." "She's waiting," he said simply. They fell into quiet again. The kind of quiet that follows relief, heavy, consuming, filled with all the words one no longer needs to say. The train's rhythm carried them onward, the steady click of wheels, the low hum of steel against steel, the faint hiss of melting snow along the undercarriage. Every sound spoke of movement, not escape, but return. Outside, the light strengthened. The frost along the fences glimmered like fine lace. Birds began to appear. First one, then two, cutting across the empty fields, flashes of motion, in a world that had forgotten color. A rook perched on a telegraph pole as the train passed, its feathers glossy black against the pale backdrop. It watched them go, head tilting, before lifting into the air with a slow, deliberate beat of its wings. Clara pressed her nose against the glass. "It's flying home," she whispered. Eleanor smiled. "So are we." The words hung in the air, delicate as breath. When Thomas stirred at last, blinking awake, the first thing he saw was the light. It filled the carriage, soft and pure, touching everything it reached. He turned toward his mother, his eyes heavy but clear. "Is it morning?" he asked. "It is," she said, brushing a damp curl from his forehead. "And you're safe, my darling. You've slept through the longest night." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that belongs only to children, simple, trusting, untouched by memory. Then he leaned against her arm and watched the world outside, his small hand finding hers. The train continued northward, leaving behind the frozen wreckage of the storm. The tracks gleamed ahead, cutting through the snow like the seam of a new beginning. For the first time in days, Eleanor felt warmth that wasn't borrowed from fire or blankets, warmth that came from within, from the quiet certainty that they were moving again, that the worst had passed, and that the light, however pale, would hold. Behind them, the night was gone. Ahead lay home waiting, patient, and bathed in white. The morning passed in a kind of hush that only comes after endurance. The train, long entombed by storm, now moved as if testing its strength, each turn of the wheels deliberate, each puff of steam rising like a sigh of relief. The air outside gleamed with the pale gold of early sunlight, that thin, hesitant light that follows hardship but does not yet trust its own warmth. The passengers, roused one by one, began to stir, not with chatter or laughter, but with the quiet grace of survivors who know what silence has cost them. Eleanor leaned her head against the glass and watched the world reclaim itself. Fences, half buried in snow, reappeared like ribs breaking through ice. Trees, bent and burdened by frost, now stood upright again, their branches glittering with shards of frozen light. The storm had left its mark, but not its dominion. The sky itself seemed washed clean. A faded blue stretched thin across the horizon. Thomas sat up fully now, pale but alert, the fever's shadow gone from his face. He looked small beneath the blanket, but his eyes were clear. "Did we stop being lost?" he asked quietly, as if afraid to break the spell of movement. Eleanor smiled and brushed her fingers through his hair. "No," she said. "The world just found us again. Clara, sitting beside him, clapped her hands softly. "It feels like the train's happy," she said, watching the steam curl past the windows in ribbons. Mr. Whitby chuckled, his first laugh since leaving London. "If I'd been asleep for 2 days under a mountain of snow, I'd be happy to be moving too." Their compartment, once so heavy with cold and fear, felt lighter now. Even the smell of coal smoke carried a sweetness the smell of warmth earned. The other passengers began to speak again, their voices cautious, like people waking from a dream they were not sure had ended. Somewhere down the carriage, someone began humming a tune, faint, rhythmic, something familiar from church halls or Christmas mornings long ago. Eleanor turned her gaze inward as the fields blurred past. The long night replayed in her mind, the frost creeping along the window, the boy's fevered breath, the engine's stillness, the sound of her own whispered prayers. It felt unreal now, distant, like something that had happened to someone else in another life. But when she looked down at Thomas, sleeping again with his toy soldier still clutched in his hand, she felt the truth of it. They had crossed through something vast and invisible and come out the other side. The conductor passed by their door, tapping lightly on the glass. "We'll reach the coast by midday," he said. "The line's clear to Whitby now. Sea wind ahead, if you can believe it." "The sea," Clara breathed, as though the word itself were a miracle. Eleanor's heart quickened at the thought. The sea had always meant endings and beginnings both. It was where her childhood had lived, the crash of waves against cliffs, the salt on her skin, the lull of tide and wind. She could almost smell it already, cold, briny, alive. As the train wound northward, the landscape changed again. The moors flattened into wide stretches of field. Here and there, frozen ponds caught the sunlight and scattered it like shards of glass. Villages appeared, clusters of stone cottages, with smoke rising thinly from their chimneys. Children wrapped in scarves chasing each other through drifts of snow. People waved at the train as it passed, small gestures that carried warmth even across the distance. Mr. Whitby rested a hand over Eleanor's. "We'll be there soon," he said quietly. She nodded, but said nothing. There was too much inside her for words: gratitude, weariness, the strange stillness that follows when fear finally loosens its grip. She turned back to the window and watched the rails stretching ahead, 2 black lines converging toward the horizon, steady and endless. Thomas stirred beside her, opening his eyes just as the train began to climb a long incline. "Mama," he said, pointing toward the east. "Look, the sun's following us." And indeed it was. The low winter sun trailed just above the snowy fields, spilling light through the rising steam. It painted the train in gold, warming the glass, gilding the frost on the windows until every carriage seemed to glow. For the first time since leaving London, Eleanor let herself breathe deeply. The air still smelled of coal and iron, but beneath it she caught something else, a hint of salt, faint but real. The sea was close, home was close. The whistle blew, strong and clear, and the train quickened its pace. The sound echoed across the frozen hills, scattering through the air like a promise kept. Eleanor leaned her head back, eyes half closed, the motion steady beneath her. The rails sang their low, metallic song. The storm was gone, the journey had resumed, and with it came the slow, certain knowledge that life, like the train, would always find a way forward, no matter how long the night or how deep the snow that tried to stop it. By the time the train reached the coast, the air had changed. It no longer smelled of iron and soot, but of salt, sharp, clean, alive. The wind carried a wetness that stung the lips and woke the senses. Even through the closed windows, the passengers could feel it, that strange, briny presence that belonged only to the sea. Eleanor lifted her head from the glass and watched as the landscape transformed before her eyes. The white moors gave way to rolling hills and open marshes, then to clusters of cottages huddled together against the wind. Smoke rose in grey ribbons from their chimneys, twisting upward until it vanished into the sky. In the distance, she could see the faint shimmer of water, pale as pewter under the morning sun. Thomas sat up, his cheeks pink again, his energy returning with each mile. "I can smell it," he said, grinning for the first time in days. "It smells like when we boiled oysters at Christmas." Clara laughed, leaning against the window. "It smells like adventure." Mr. Whitby smiled faintly, though his eyes softened at the sight of them both. "It smells like home," he said. As the train rounded the last curve, the first glimpse of the village appeared, a spire piercing the mist, roofs glinting beneath a film of frost, and the faint suggestion of the sea beyond that wide grey horizon where land gave up and water began. Bells began to toll from the church at the centre, their sound drifting faintly across the air, not solemn, but welcoming. Each note seemed to say, "You've come far enough. You can rest now." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. The sound reached her like a memory, something half-remembered from her girlhood, the way Sunday mornings used to begin at Whitby Hall. Bells over the cliffs, gulls crying over the harbour, the smell of bread and salt mingling in the air. It felt like a lifetime ago, like a story she had once told herself before London had made her forget how it ended. The train slowed, the whistle sounding once, long and low. Steam billowed across the platform, obscuring everything for a moment, a world made of cloud and shadow. Then the smoke thinned, revealing people waiting along the edge, porters with red noses, fishermen in thick coats, a woman selling roasted chestnuts beside a brazier, and there, near the end of the platform, holding a lamp despite the daylight, stood her mother. Eleanor's breath caught. She hadn't imagined her standing there, not after the letter's trembling hand, not after the years between them. But there she was, smaller than she remembered, wrapped in layers of shawl, her grey hair pinned neatly beneath a bonnet. Her face was lined and pale, but her eyes, those same clear eyes Eleanor had known since childhood, were bright with unshed tears. Mr. Whitby saw her too. He reached for Eleanor's hand and squeezed it once, his voice quiet. "Go to her." She didn't hesitate. The train hadn't even come to a full stop before she was on her feet, guiding the children down the aisle. The doors opened with a hiss, and the cold coastal air rushed in. It filled her lungs, sharp and real, chasing away the ghost of London smoke. On the platform, time seemed to slow. Her mother's lamp flickered in the wind, the light trembling but unbroken. Eleanor crossed the distance between them in a few hurried steps, the sound of her boots muffled by snow. And then, for the first time in years, they were face to face, no letters, no distance, no words. Her mother smiled faintly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You came. I told you I would." They embraced awkwardly at first, then fully, as though the years themselves gave way beneath the weight of that moment. The scent of lavender still clung to her mother's shawl, mixed now with salt and coal smoke. Eleanor felt her throat tighten as she held on longer than she meant to, longer than time allowed. Behind them, the church bells rang again, louder now, joined by the cry of gulls wheeling above the harbour. The sound filled the air until it seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the hills, the roofs, the sea itself. Thomas and Clara pressed close to their grandmother, shy but smiling. Mr. Whitby approached quietly, his hat in hand. The older woman reached out, took his hand without a word, and nodded once. Whatever had been unsaid between them, apology, gratitude, forgiveness, was settled in that gesture. For a moment, the four of them stood together on the platform while the rest of the village went about its life, fishermen calling, carts creaking, bells still singing overhead. The storm, the fever, the cold, all of it was behind them now. Before them lay the sea, vast and grey and endless, yet somehow gentle. Eleanor looked toward the horizon. The smoke from the chimneys rose straight into the sky, no longer twisted by the wind. She took a deep breath of the salt air and smiled. The journey was over, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she believed that they had truly come home. The road from the station wound upward through the village like a memory retraced. The snow there was not deep, only a soft dusting that gleamed in the light, and the cobblestones beneath shone wet and dark from the morning thaw. Houses leaned close together, their windows fogged with cooking fires, their doorsteps strewn with coal dust and boot prints. Every doorway seemed to hold a shape of familiarity, some remnant of her childhood, the crooked sign of the baker's shop, the sound of the same old church bell tolling the quarter hour. Eleanor walked with her mother's arm in hers, guiding her carefully along the slope, while Mr. Whitby and the children followed just behind. The lamp her mother had carried from the station had gone out at last, but she held it still, as though it were not a tool but a talisman, the last flicker of the long years spent waiting. When they reached the crest of the hill, Whitby Hall came into view, its chimneys breathing slow curls of smoke into the cold air. The house stood grey and broad, built from stone so old it seemed grown from the earth itself. Snow clung to its eaves and window-sills, softening the hard lines of its age. Though Eleanor had imagined this return 100 times, the sight of it stole her breath. For a moment she could not move. Her mother squeezed her arm gently. "It looks smaller, doesn't it?" Eleanor nodded. "Everything does, except the feeling of it." They passed through the iron gate, which groaned like a familiar voice greeting them. The garden beyond lay sleeping under frost, rows of bare hedges, the skeletons of rose bushes, the bird bath frozen to its brim. The front steps had been swept clean, and a wreath of holly hung on the door, glinting faintly in the light. Someone had kept watch here after all. The door opened before they could knock. A figure appeared, a woman with flour still dusting her hands, her apron tied tight around her waist. "Mrs. Eleanor," she cried, her accent thick as the moor fog. "By heaven, you made it through the snow." "Hello, Ruth," Eleanor said, smiling despite herself. "Still baking before sunrise, I see." The housekeeper's eyes filled with tears. "We thought the storm might have taken you, miss, or that London had claimed you for good." "London never truly keeps anyone," Mr. Whitby said, stepping forward with a tired grin. "It only lends you to yourself and takes your peace in exchange." Ruth laughed, a soft, trembling sound. "Well, your peace is here waiting." She stepped aside to let them in, and the warmth of the hall rushed over them like an embrace. Inside, the air smelled of coal smoke, bread, and oranges drying over the hearth. The entryway was just as Eleanor remembered, the grandfather clock ticking steadily in its corner, the same portrait of her father staring down from the landing, stern and proud even in faded paint. Clara ran ahead, her small boots squeaking on the stone floor. "It's like a castle," she said, spinning in a slow circle. "Do people live here all the time?" "They do now," her grandmother said gently, lowering herself into a chair near the fire. "And so do you." Eleanor knelt beside her, unpinning her mother's shawl. The older woman's face was pale from the walk, but her eyes were bright, the color of the sea at dusk. "You shouldn't have come all the way to meet us," Eleanor murmured. "You could have caught your death in that cold." Her mother smiled faintly. "Child, after so many winters alone, I was already halfway there. It was the waiting that made me ill, not the weather." The clock struck once. Somewhere deep in the house, a door opened, and the faint echo of a dog's bark carried through the hall. The fire in the grate popped, sending sparks skittering up the chimney. For the first time in months, Eleanor let herself sit still. The long ache of the journey, the cold, the fear, the nights without sleep began to slip away, replaced by the slow weight of belonging. Mr. Whitby stood at the mantel, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the flames. The children knelt before the hearth, their faces rosy from heat and wonder. Her mother reached for her hand. "Do you remember what I told you when you left for London? That the world is wide and rarely kind," Eleanor said. Her mother shook her head. "No, I said that no matter how far you go, there will always be a door waiting for you to open. You've found it again." Outside, the church bells began to ring once more, their sound rolling over the village and up through the hills. It mingled with the crackle of the fire and the hum of the wind along the windows, a harmony of things both familiar and new. And as Eleanor leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, she realized how true it was. Every journey, every mile of snow and silence had been leading to this one door, opening now not just into a house, but into peace. By midday, the house had come alive with the soft, careful chaos of return. Footsteps crossed the floorboards, the kettle sang on the hob, and the scent of baking bread wound through every room like a memory rediscovering its way home. The old grandfather clock that had stood silent since her father's passing had been wound again. Its slow, steady ticking filled the quiet with something that felt like breathing. Outside, the sky hung low and bright, the snow melting into silver rivulets that traced along the garden path. Eleanor stood at the dining room threshold, her hand resting against the frame. The long oak table stretched before her, newly polished and already half set. Ruth and the kitchen boy moved briskly between it and the sideboard, their motions practiced and wordless. A fire crackled in the hearth beneath the tall mantel, and sunlight slid through the frosted windows, casting soft halos over the dishes waiting to be filled. Her mother sat at the head of the table, wrapping polished silverware in linen napkins. The frailness of her hands startled Eleanor. At first they were thin, almost translucent, the veins blue beneath the skin, yet her movements were sure. She still had that same quiet precision that Eleanor had inherited and carried into her own adulthood without realizing. When her mother looked up, her expression softened into that small, almost secret smile. "We'll need another chair," she said. "One for Thomas, he's tall enough to sit with the grown ones now." Eleanor's throat tightened. "It seems so," she said, glancing at the doorway where her children lingered, wide-eyed at the sight of so much light and food. Clara had already crept toward the loaf cooling on the table's edge, fingers twitching with temptation. Thomas stood beside her, his toy soldier clutched loosely in his hand, a faint blush of health returning to his cheeks. "Mind your manners, miss," Mr. Whitby called from behind them, his voice lighter than it had been in days. He entered, carrying a log for the fire, setting it gently onto the hearth. "Though I admit, that bread does smell like a miracle." "It is one," Ruth replied, dusting her apron. "We haven't baked with fresh yeast since last Christmas." "Then this will be a Christmas worth remembering," Eleanor's mother said quietly, tying the last ribbon around the napkins. "One to make up for all the quiet ones." The sound of the word quiet lingered, heavy and kind at once. For so many years, the house had lived inside that quiet, the kind that fills the corners when laughter is gone, the kind that smells of dust and waiting. But now the silence had shape again, the whisper of children's voices, the clatter of cups, the rhythmic crackle of the fire. Eleanor crossed the room to adjust a candle. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the window pane, her face thinner, older, marked by the long London years. Yet beneath the exhaustion, she felt something stirring, a warmth rising like light beneath snow. Her mother's voice broke through her thoughts. "Do you remember when we filled this table?" Eleanor smiled softly. "Every Sunday, it seemed." "There were 10 of us then," her mother said. "You, your brothers, the farmhands, the vicar, and your father at the head telling stories no one could interrupt." Eleanor's eyes dropped to the wood grain beneath her hand. "And now there are fewer." Her mother reached for her wrist, her grip surprisingly firm. "There are enough." The kitchen door swung open, and Ruth emerged carrying a pot of stew, its steam curling upward in fragrant ribbons. "Beef and barley," she announced. "There's bread, butter, and fruit preserved from autumn. It isn't London fare, but it'll fill every soul that sits here." Eleanor looked to her husband, who nodded and began helping Ruth set the dishes. The children climbed onto their chairs, eyes wide, cheeks flushed with anticipation. Her mother folded her hands over the tablecloth and bowed her head. "Let us give thanks," she whispered, "for safe arrivals, for warm rooms, and for those who journey still." The room fell quiet, save for the ticking of the clock and the soft hiss of the fire. Eleanor's gaze moved around the table, her husband's tired smile, her son's recovering face, her daughter's gleaming eyes, her mother's trembling hands. When they began to eat, laughter came hesitant at first, then rising easily. filling the corners of the old house like a tide returning to shore. The windows glowed with warmth against the pale afternoon, and outside, snow continued to melt from the eaves, dripping rhythmically into the thawing earth. Later, when the plates were cleared and the candles burned low, Eleanor realized something simple and profound. The house no longer felt like it was remembering its past. It was living its present, and as she sat beside her mother, watching her children share bread in the firelight, she understood what all their long journey had been leading toward, not merely survival, but this moment of stillness, where love, once scattered by time and distance, had gathered again around a single table set for 10. That night, the fire in the parlor burned until well past midnight. The house, though quiet now, still carried the echo of laughter in its walls. Every room seemed softer somehow, the shadows less sharp. Outside, the snow had stopped completely, leaving behind a world that gleamed under moonlight. Frost laced the window panes in patterns delicate as lace, and the fields beyond the house shimmered like glass. The storm that had swallowed half of England only days before now lay sleeping, its fury spent. Eleanor stood by the window in her nightdress, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. Behind her, the faint murmur of her children's breathing rose and fell in the small adjoining room. Across the hall, her mother's lamp still glowed beneath the door, the quiet vigil of someone who had known too many nights of worry. There were no presents beneath the tree in the parlor this year, no polished parcels tied with ribbon, no paper crowns waiting in a box. They had not planned for gifts, not with the journey's cost and the long uncertainty of travel. Yet as Eleanor looked around the room, she felt none of the absence that London's Christmases had carried. The decorations were simple. Holly strung above the mantel, a few sprigs of ivy wound around the stair banister, a candle in every window. But the air itself felt festive, not with riches or extravagance, but with life returned. Mr. Whitby came quietly down the stairs, the soft creak of the steps announcing him. He carried 2 mugs of steaming milk, one in each hand. "I thought you'd still be awake," he said, smiling gently. "You've always been the last to sleep and the first to rise." Eleanor took the cup and breathed in its warmth. "Habit, I suppose. The silence feels different here. It keeps me awake." He joined her by the window, gazing out across the moonlit garden. "London's silence is loud," he said, "all smoke and ticking clocks. This," he gestured toward the dark horizon, "this is the kind that listens back." For a while they said nothing, drinking in the quiet and the faint, rhythmic crackle of the dying fire. Then Eleanor spoke, her voice soft but certain. "The children will wake, expecting something under the tree." Mr. Whitby nodded. "And there'll be nothing but pine needles and candle wax. Do you think they'll understand?" He looked at her, the corners of his mouth lifting. "They've already been given everything that matters." She smiled at that. "You sound like a sermon." "Then it's the truest one I've ever preached." From the hearth came a faint pop, followed by the slow collapse of an ember. The air smelled faintly of orange peel and soot. Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the weight of the years that had brought them here, the hardship, the choices, the small daily hopes that had carried them through. "I used to think Christmas was about filling the house," she said, after a time, "filling it with sound, with gifts, with proof that we were happy. But it isn't that, is it?" "No," he said quietly. "It's about being full enough to need nothing." When dawn came, it arrived gently pink and pale, slipping through the curtains like a breath. The house stirred slowly. The creak of beds, the whisper of slippers on the floorboards, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. The children burst into the parlor first, their laughter echoing through the halls. "Mama!" Clara cried. "There's no presents, but look! There's light everywhere!" Indeed, the whole room shimmered with the glow of morning. The frost on the windows had turned to crystal, catching the sunlight like tiny gems. The table by the hearth held a single loaf of bread dusted with sugar, and beside it a pitcher of milk and 2 apples, the only offerings the pantry could spare. Eleanor smiled, kneeling beside them. "Then that's our feast," she said, "and our gift is that we're here to share it." Thomas looked thoughtful, then reached into his pocket and set his wooden soldier on the mantel. "Then this can be for everyone," he said solemnly. Her husband bent to whisper in her ear, "You see? No gifts, and yet everything given." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but she did not hide them. She looked around the room at the fire, the children, the soft light spilling over the table, and she thought of the journey that had carried them here, the snow, the sickness, the nights without end. It had all led to this quiet morning, to this simple peace. The bells from the church began to ring again, faint and slow, drifting through the crisp air, and as the sound filled the house, Eleanor realized that though there were no ribbons, no gold, no gifts wrapped in paper, this was the richest Christmas she had ever known, a Christmas not of things, but of return. For once, there was no more wanting, only warmth, only home. The following morning dawned pale and clear, the kind of winter light that makes everything look freshly born. A faint mist still clung to the moors beyond the village, softening the edges of the hills. Inside Whitby Hall, the fire had burned low, leaving behind a faint orange glow that trembled against the hearth. The smell of bread and wood smoke lingered in the air, mingling with the salt that drifted in through the cracks of the old window frames. Thomas awoke slowly, as though surfacing from deep water. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was, only that the ceiling above him was white and still, and that his mother's voice came from somewhere nearby, low and humming. When he turned his head, he saw her sitting by the window, darning a sock by the light of a single candle. The snow outside reflected the dawn, casting her face in gold and grey. "Morning, Mama," he murmured. Eleanor looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Good morning, my love." Her voice carried both relief and disbelief, as though she couldn't quite trust the sound of it. "How do you feel?" He considered this seriously, brow furrowing. "Hungry," he said. It was the most beautiful word she'd heard in weeks. She crossed the room and pressed her hand to his forehead. It was cool now, his skin soft and dry. The fever had passed completely, leaving only the faintest flush in his cheeks, the pink of returning life. "You frightened us half to death," she said, smiling as tears filled her eyes. "I didn't mean to," he replied, his voice small. "It just got so cold inside my head." Eleanor brushed his hair back gently. "The cold's gone now? You're safe. And there's broth waiting if you can sit up." Downstairs, the house was already stirring. Clara's laughter drifted up the stairs, mingled with Ruth's firm scolding about crumbs and spoons. Mr. Whitby's deep voice echoed faintly from the parlour, something about the weather, clearing, and the ships in the harbour returning to dock. Life, it seemed, had resumed its old rhythm. The storm had left its scars, but people were quick to move forward once warmth returned. Thomas sat upright slowly, the blanket sliding down his shoulders. "Will Grandma be at breakfast?" he asked. "She will," Eleanor said. "She's been waiting for you to come down since dawn." He smiled, shy but proud. "Then I should hurry." With her help, he dressed his small fingers, fumbling with buttons stiff from the wash. When he stood at last, she saw how much thinner he'd grown. The sickness had taken more than she'd realized, but he stood, and that was enough. They descended the stairs together. The sunlight through the hallway windows made the floor shine, and the smell of broth, toast, and butter filled the air. At the bottom of the staircase stood Eleanor's mother, wrapped in her shawl, her eyes bright and wet. "There's my brave lad," she said softly, arms opening. Thomas hesitated only a moment before running to her. She held him tightly, pressing her cheek to the top of his head. "The fever's gone," she whispered. "The angels gave him back." Eleanor looked away for a moment, blinking fast. She had not prayed for angels, only for breath, for warmth, for one more morning. But perhaps they came all the same, in quieter forms. A mother's hand on a child's brow, the steady rumble of a train through snow, the light that followed darkness, whether one asked for it or not. Breakfast was simple broth, bread, and the last of the apples stored in the pantry. Yet it felt like a feast. Clara chattered between bites, her excitement spilling out in all directions. "Now that Thomas is better," she said, "can we see the sea today?" Mr. Whitby looked up from his cup of tea. "We'll all go," he said. "After so many nights trapped by frost, we'll stand where the world is wide again." Eleanor smiled, watching her. Children eat, her husband's shoulders finally at ease. The warmth in the room spread slowly, not from the fire but from them, from breath, from laughter, from life returned. When breakfast was done, Ruth cleared the table, humming to herself. Thomas sat by the window with his wooden soldier, holding it up to the light. The toy's paint was chipped, but it caught the morning sun and shone like new. "I think he's a lucky soldier," the boy said. Eleanor kissed the top of his head. "Then he belongs in this house." Outside, the bells from the church began to ring again, clear and bright this time, their tones rising into the crisp morning air. The sound carried over the hills, through the melting snow, all the way to the sea. And as Eleanor listened, she realized that the world, for all its cruelty, was still capable of mercy. Her son was alive. The house was full. The journey that had begun in fear had ended in light. Whitby Hall breathed again, and with it, so did she. The sun had climbed higher by the time they left the house, though it gave more light than heat. The sky was pale and clear, the kind of blue that made every sound seem sharper, the creak of boots on frozen earth, the rustle of coats, the low murmur of the sea somewhere beyond the hills. The storm had scoured the world clean. Every branch, every stone wall, every chimney gleamed as if remade. The family walked slowly through the village lane, their breath rising in faint white clouds. Eleanor held Thomas's hand, steadying his steps. He was still weak from the fever, but his face was bright with the wonder of being outdoors again. Clara ran ahead, laughing, her curls bouncing beneath her bonnet. Mr. Whitby followed a few paces behind, one gloved hand resting lightly on his wife's shoulder when the road turned icy. The path to the churchyard wound upward, narrow and uneven. Frost clung to the edges of the hedgerows, and the air carried the faint, bittersweet scent of smoke from hearth fires below. The church stood at the crest of the hill, its steeple black against the white sky. From its tower, the bells were still. Only the soft crunch of snow beneath their boots marked the passing of time. When they reached the gate, Eleanor paused. The iron was cold beneath her palm. The graveyard beyond stretched in quiet rows, each stone half buried in snow. It was a place of peace, though not of sorrow, the kind of peace that comes when time has done its slow work of softening pain into memory. Her mother had insisted they come. "It isn't mourning," she had said at breakfast, her voice calm but sure. "It's remembrance, and remembrance is a duty of the living." Now she stood by the gate, her shawl pulled tight against the wind, waiting for them to join her. When they did, she led them down one of the narrow paths between the stones, until they stopped before a grave near the yew tree. The stone was simple, grey, unpolished, its lettering softened by years of wind and rain. Eleanor knelt first, brushing the snow away with her gloved hand. The name carved there made her throat tighten. Edward Whitby, 1819 to 1878, her father, the man whose shadow had stretched through every corridor of her childhood, stern and steady, his love rarely spoken but always felt. Beside her, her mother bowed her head. "He would have been proud of you," she said softly. Eleanor's breath caught in the cold air. "I'm not sure he would have understood London. He wouldn't have needed to. He'd only have looked at you and known you'd found your way." Thomas crouched beside her, eyes wide and solemn. "Is grandfather here?" he asked. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Not all of him, just the part that stays to remember." The boy nodded, accepting this easily, the way children accept truth when it is wrapped in gentleness. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wooden soldier, the same one he'd carried through the journey. "He can have this," he said. "It's lucky." Eleanor's hands trembled as she took the toy from him. "Are you sure?" Thomas nodded. "He kept us safe in the storm. Now he can keep grandfather safe too." She placed the small soldier on the stone. Its painted face turned toward the sea. The wind shifted then, carrying the faint sound of waves crashing against the distant cliffs. For a moment, Eleanor thought she heard another sound layered beneath it, the low, steady hum of the train, that iron heart still beating far away. Mr. Whitby knelt beside her, his hand covering hers. "It's a good place," he said. "He's got the view he always wanted, the sea at his feet and the sky above." They stood there for a long time, saying nothing. The cold bit at their cheeks, but it was the kind of cold that felt clean, like renewal. Behind them, the church door creaked open, and a thin ribbon of music drifted out, the organist practicing for the morning service. The notes rose into the air, mingling with the wind, until the whole world seemed to hum with quiet life. As they turned to leave, Eleanor looked back once more. The little soldier gleamed faintly in the winter sun, a flash of color against the grey stone. It seemed to her then that her father would not have minded this offering, that somewhere beyond the snow and silence, he might have smiled at the sight. When they reached the gate again, her mother took her arm, her voice low but firm. "That's how we honor the dead," she said, "by bringing them the living." Eleanor glanced down at her son and daughter, their faces pink from the cold, and felt something in her chest loosen, not grief, but a deep, steady calm. The bells began to ring again as they walked back down the hill, their sound clear and strong, echoing over the white fields and the endless, watchful sea. By midday, the family reached the cliffs that overlooked the sea. The snow thinned there, swept away by salt wind, leaving behind dark patches of grass and stone slick with frost. Below, the waves rolled and broke in long, slow breaths, their white crests glinting beneath the pale sunlight. The storm that had held the land hostage had not touched the water the same way, it had only made it more restless, more alive. The tide moved with purpose, heavy and full, as if reclaiming what the cold had taken. The path down to the beach was steep and narrow, carved into the side of the cliff where gulls perched and cried into the wind. Eleanor went first, her skirts gathered in one hand, her other arm guiding Thomas. Mr. Whitby followed close behind with Clara, who insisted on walking by herself until the first patch of ice made her slip and grab his coat. Their laughter echoed down the cliffside, thin and bright against the steady roar of the waves. When they reached the shore, the air was sharp with salt. The wind tugged at their coats and filled their hair with sea mist. The sand was a mottled grey, frozen in places where the tide had kissed and left it to harden. Bits of driftwood and seaweed lay scattered like forgotten offerings. Thomas broke away first, running toward the line of waves, his boots crunching over the pebbles. "It's bigger than I remember," he shouted. "It sounds like thunder." "That's because the sea never truly sleeps," Eleanor said, smiling despite the cold. She had forgotten how it felt to hear it, that endless rhythm of motion, patient and powerful. The sound seemed to reach inside her, untangling everything that had tightened over the long, bitter journey. Clara ran after her brother, chasing gulls that lifted into the air with startled cries. Their footprints, small and fleeting, marked the untouched sand before the wind smoothed them away. Mr. Whitby stood beside his wife, his gaze on the horizon where the sky met, the water in a thin, silver line. "It feels strange," he said quietly, "to have come all this way only to end where we began." Eleanor turned to him, her eyes soft. "That's what journeys do. They bring you back, but changed." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I didn't think I'd see this again, not after London swallowed us whole." "Then it's time to let it go," she said. "The soot, the noise, the sickness, all of it. The sea can keep what we don't need." He looked at her then, really looked, the lines of her face softened by light, her eyes steady and clear. He took her hand, rough and cold, and pressed it to his chest. "Then let it take the fear," he murmured. They stood together, letting the wind whip their coats, and the sound of the surf filled the spaces between words. The children's laughter drifted toward them like music carried by tide and time. Thomas was kneeling near the waterline now, tracing circles in the wet sand with a stick. When the next wave surged, he darted back, laughing, his boots splashed but his spirit unharmed. Clara joined him, holding a shell up to the light. "Look, it's pink like a rose." Eleanor crouched beside them, examining it. "That's the sea's way of remembering summer," she said. "Everything it touches, it changes, but it never forgets where it's been." They gathered a few shells and smooth stones, placing them in Clara's scarf. "For Grandma," Thomas said solemnly, "so she can have the sea inside the house." Eleanor smiled. "She'll like that." When they began the climb back up the hill, the wind had shifted. The scent of salt was mixed now with chimney smoke from the village, a promise of warmth waiting above. The path was steep, but the children's chatter made it feel shorter. At the top, they paused to look back. The sea stretched far and endless, its surface alive with light. The tide was rising again, washing over their footprints, carrying their laughter out into the open water. Eleanor took one last deep breath of the salt air. "When I was a girl," she said softly, "I used to think the sea was the edge of the world." Mr. Whitby looked at her, his breath visible in the cold air. "And what do you think now?" "That it's the beginning," she said. They stood for a long moment, watching the horizon, the silver line where everything met and began again. Then, with hands linked and hearts lighter than they had been in years, they turned back toward Whitby Hall, the sound of the sea following behind them like a benediction. The storm was gone. The world had thawed, and though winter still held its crown, spring faint, distant, but certain had begun its slow return on the wind. 2 days after their walk to the sea, the first post since the storm arrived in Whitby, the mail coach came creaking into the village just after sunrise, its wheels crusted with frozen mud, and its horses steaming from the long climb over the moors. The driver handed the bundle of letters to the postmaster, who sorted them on the counter while the villagers gathered in their scarves and caps, waiting for word from the world beyond the snow. Ruth brought the letter to the hall mid-morning, tucked carefully in her apron pocket. The paper was crumpled at the corners, the ink smeared by damp, but the seal remained intact. Deep red wax marked with the crest of a printing house, Eleanor knew too well. She stood by the parlour window, turning it over in her hands. "It's from London," she said quietly. "From the Chronicle." Mr. Whitby looked up from the fire where he was mending a broken chair leg. "The paper you wrote for?" She nodded. "Before we left, I sent them a small piece, something about the city during the frost. I never thought they'd answer." He rose, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. "Open it, then. The world has followed us home." The letter was brief, written in a firm, elegant hand. "Mrs. Eleanor Whitby," it began. "Your essay has been read with great admiration. We would publish it in next week's issue under the title A London Winter. Should you ever return to the city, we would be glad to see more of your work." Below the signature, a note in smaller script added, "Your words made the cold feel human." Eleanor read it twice before lowering the page. Her pulse thrummed softly in her throat. It wasn't a fortune, nor a promise of fame, just an acknowledgement, but one that meant more than she had expected. For years, her writing had lived in shadows, tucked between housework and the endless noise of London's fog. Now it had crossed that distance and found a voice of its own. Mr. Whitby smiled as he took the letter, scanning its contents. "You'll write again," he said. It wasn't a question. "I might," she admitted, still uncertain, "though perhaps not for London." "For here, then," he said, gesturing toward the window, where the sunlight shone through the frost like glass. "Stories don't belong to cities alone." She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the mantel drawer, beside her father's watch and her mother's spectacles, things that had measured time, seen years pass, and survived. At the table, Thomas and Clara were playing a quiet game of building towers from wooden blocks. "What's the letter say, Mama?" Clara asked without looking up. "That we're remembered," Eleanor said. Ruth entered then with a tray of tea and small biscuits dusted with sugar. "The postmaster said the road south is clear again," she remarked. "London's thawed at last." "Let it," Eleanor said softly. "The thaws come here too." The warmth in the house that morning was different, not just from the fire, but from something unspoken. The long weight of fear and uncertainty had lifted. Outside, the snow was melting in rivulets along the garden wall, trickling into the soil like a pulse returning. Her mother joined her by the window, moving slowly, her cane tapping lightly on the wood floor. "A letter from London," she said. "Does it call you back?" Eleanor shook her head. "No. It reminded me that I was already gone before I ever left." Her mother smiled faintly. "Then you've done the hardest thing, you've returned to yourself." They stood together, watching as the postman's carriage disappeared down the road, leaving twin tracks that gleamed with meltwater. In the distance, the church bells began to chime the noon hour, a sound not of warning or grief this time, but of ordinary life continuing. Mr. Whitby approached and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Write tonight," he said. "Not for them, for us, for here." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I will." And that evening, when the house had grown quiet and the fire burned low, she sat at her father's old desk by the window. She took up her pen, dipped it into the inkwell, and began a new piece, not about London or its frost, but about Whitby. The storm, the train, the journey through snow, the family that waited, and the light that followed. Each word came easily now, steady and warm. Outside, the wind had stilled, and the first stars appeared over the moors, clear and bright as bells. And for the first time in many winters, Eleanor felt not like a passenger caught between places, but the author of her own homecoming. That evening fell soft and slow, the kind of dusk that draped itself gently over the moors like a shawl. The sky deepened to lavender, then to blue, then to the velvet black of a night unbroken by cloud. The air outside was still cold enough to sting, but it carried a sweetness now, the faint smell of thawing earth, of salt, of wood smoke drifting from 100 chimneys. For the first time in months, the world no longer felt closed. Inside Whitby Hall, the household moved quietly through the evening. The children were upstairs with Ruth, their laughter spilling faintly down the stairwell like the flutter of birds. Mr. Whitby sat by the hearth, polishing the brass lantern that had once hung by the carriage door. His movements were slow, deliberate, and oddly peaceful. Across from him, Eleanor's mother dozed in her chair, a shawl drawn up to her chin, the light from the fire turning the edges of her silver hair to gold. Eleanor herself sat at the writing desk again, her pen resting above a blank page. The room was dim but warm, the only light coming from the small candle beside her and the flicker of the hearth. The letter from London lay folded on the mantel, untouched since morning. She had written since then notes, fragments, sentences that led nowhere, but now her hand hovered motionless, caught between the weight of the day and the pull of the dark. She could hear the faint wind outside, brushing against the windows. It was the same wind that had howled through the train days before, the same one that had carried snow through the cracks of the door. But tonight it sounded different, softer, almost kind. Her husband looked up from his work. "You haven't lit the window candle," he said gently. "I forgot," she admitted. He smiled. "Then we'll do it together. My father used to say a light in the window meant no one was lost on the road." She rose, fetching the tall brass candlestick from the sideboard. Together, they carried it to the skier's wide front window that looked out over the lane. Eleanor struck a match, and for a moment the smell of sulphur filled the room. The flame took quickly, blooming gold and steady. She set the candle in the sill, where it caught the reflection of the glass and doubled itself 2 flames instead of 1, burning side by side. Outside, the light spilled across the garden path, across the gate, and into the road beyond. It shimmered faintly on the melting snow, catching the drips that fell from the eaves like tiny jewels. Somewhere down in the village, a late traveller might glance up from the road and see it, a promise that warmth still waited somewhere in the dark. Eleanor stood watching it for a long time. "When I was a girl," she said softly, "my mother used to keep a candle burning for my father whenever he was at sea. I thought it was just habit or fear, but now I think it was a way of saying, 'Come back. You are still remembered.'" Mr. Whitby placed a hand at the small of her back. Then it seems right that it should burn again. They stood in silence as the candle flame swayed gently in the draught. Its light painted their faces, gold at first, then silver as the wax burned lower. The rhythm of the house slowed with it, the quiet of the clock, the settling sigh of the fire, the muffled laughter of the children overhead giving way to silence. When at last Eleanor turned back to her desk, she found that the words came easily again. She wrote not about London this time, nor about the journey through the snow, but about light, the small, stubborn kind that people keep burning even when no one is watching. Her words grew steady. Sure, there is a candle in every house that has ever waited through winter, not for kings or miracles, but for return. It burns for the ones who went out into the storm and found their way home again. She paused, setting the pen down, and looked once more toward the window. The candle still glowed, unwavering. Her husband touched her shoulder gently. "Come to bed soon," he said. "You've written enough for one night." She nodded, but didn't move. The light had her still. When the rest of the house finally fell quiet, Eleanor remained awake at the desk. Outside, frost was forming again on the stones, but the sky was clear. Stars stretched across it, hundreds, thousands, as if the heavens themselves had lit their own candles to answer hers. And when she finally blew out the flame, the glass held its ghost for a heartbeat longer, a reflection, a promise, a memory before fading softly into the dark, leaving only warmth behind. By the third week of their stay, the thaw was complete. The snow that had buried fields and roads had melted into soft ribbons of water that wound through the village lanes and disappeared into the sea. The earth had begun to breathe again. Patches of green showed through the mud along the edges of the road, and the first shoots of crocus and winter aconite poked bravely through the soil by the churchyard gate. On that Sunday morning, the air felt different, lighter, expectant. The bells that had fallen silent through the storm rang out again for the first full service since Christmas. Their tone rolled through the hills like laughter returning to a house after grief. The sound carried all the way to Whitby Hall, where it reached the open windows like a summons. Eleanor was in the kitchen, tying the last ribbon around Clara's bonnet when she heard it. She stopped, her hands stilling for a moment, and closed her eyes. "They're ringing again," she said softly. Her mother looked up from her chair by the hearth. "They were never gone, child. They only needed warmth to wake them." The walk to the church was bright and easy compared to the trek of weeks before. The family followed the lane through the village, past shopkeepers sweeping slush from their thresholds and fishermen mending nets beside the harbour wall. Life was spilling back into motion, carrying its small routines and familiar voices. Even the gulls seemed louder, as if rejoicing in the return of noise. When they reached the churchyard, the air smelled faintly of salt and wet stone. The doors were propped open, the interior glowing with candlelight. Villagers gathered inside, shedding cloaks and scarves, stamping their boots clean before taking their seats. The pews creaked with the sound of reunion. Eleanor and her family found a place near the front, beneath the window where coloured light streamed across the worn floorboards. She could feel the warmth of the fire built near the altar, its smoke curling faintly through the rafters. The vicar, a small man with a voice like wind over the moors, greeted them with a nod of recognition. As the service began, Eleanor found her mind wandering not away from prayer, but deeper into it. The familiar words sounded different now, carrying new meaning after what they had endured. "Deliver us from the storm, lead us through the dark, restore to us the morning." The lines she had once recited without thought now thrummed with truth. Thomas leaned against her arm, whispering, "Do they ring the bells for God or for people?" She smiled. "For both, I think. God listens from the heavens, and people listen from their windows." He considered this, his gaze on the stained glass above. "Then I'm glad they came back. It's too quiet when the world doesn't sing." After the hymn, the vicar spoke of gratitude for survival, for mercy, for the simple grace of return. His voice echoed against the stone arches, weaving through the rafters like thread through fabric. Eleanor's fingers found her husband's beneath the pew rail, their hands fitting together in silence. When the service ended, the congregation stepped outside into a sunlight so clear it almost hurt to look at. The bells began again, faster this time, jubilant. Their sound mingled with the waves below the cliffs, and for a moment the whole village seemed to vibrate with the rhythm of life. Children ran ahead down the lane, tossing handfuls of melting snow at one another. Clara's bonnet came undone, her laughter ringing louder than the bells themselves. Eleanor's mother followed slowly, her cane tapping against the path. "I told you," she said, smiling. "Warmth always brings the bells back." As they walked home, Eleanor looked over her shoulder at the church on the hill. The bell tower gleamed against the sky, its windows flashing with light. For weeks it had been a silent sentinel during their passage through darkness, and now it was alive again, ringing not for warning, but for joy. That night, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned to rose, the bells rang once more, not for service, but simply because the villagers asked them to. The sound rolled over the moors, reached the frozen edge of the sea, and drifted outward until it was no longer sound but memory. Eleanor stood at the window of Whitby Hall, listening as their echoes faded into the coming night. "They ring for the living," she whispered. Mr. Whitby joined her there, his arm sliding around her waist. "And the living answer," he said. Outside, the candle still burned in the window, its small flame mirrored in the glass, and above it all, faint but clear, the bells continued to sing a song of return, of endurance, of home found again after the longest winter in memory. By the time the last week of January arrived, the moors had shed their final skin of ice. The air smelled faintly of wet soil and grass returning to life. Though winter still held the land, its grip had loosened enough for birds to sing again in the hedgerows, enough for the earth to glisten with melt instead of frost. Each morning the sun rose a little earlier, gilding the windows of Whitby Hall before the fires were even lit. Eleanor awoke that morning to silence, the kind that felt kind rather than empty. The candle she had left in the window the night before had burned down to a stub, its wax pooled in the dish like frozen milk. She rose quietly so as not to wake the others and crossed to the window, where pale light gathered on the horizon. The hills beyond the village glowed faintly, their edges softened by mist. For the first time in months, there was no snow, no grey sky, no shadow pressing against the glass, only light. Downstairs, the house stirred slowly to life. Kettle began to sing, and the smell of toasted bread drifted through the hall. Her mother was already in her chair by the fire, wrapped in her shawl, gazing toward the window. "The mornings are stretching longer," she said softly. "Do you see it? The earth remembers how to turn again." "I see it," Eleanor said, kneeling to warm her hands by the fire. "It feels like something waking." Mr. Whitby entered soon after, fastening his coat. "The harbour's open again," he said. "They'll be mending nets down by the shore. I'll take Thomas to watch the boats go out." Eleanor smiled, though the thought of letting her son out into the cold still stirred old fears. "Take a scarf for him," she said, "and gloves." "I will." He leaned to kiss her cheek. "You should come too. It'll do you good to breathe the sea air." She hesitated. "Perhaps later. There's something I mean to finish first." He nodded, not pressing her. He had learned, in their years, together, that when Eleanor said finish, it meant she was beginning something worth keeping. When they left, she went to her writing desk and opened the small stack of papers she had begun weeks ago, her story of the journey, of the storm, of the long train that refused to die in the snow. She read it through slowly, feeling the rhythm of the words as though they belonged not only to her but to everyone who had shared that frozen night. The last page was still blank. She dipped her pen into the inkwell, the tip catching the morning light, and began to write the ending. And when at last the snow began to fall no more, they found that life had not paused, only waited. The fire burned again, the bells returned, and every heart that had trembled through the dark remembered how to beat in time with the morning. She paused, the ink drying as she read the lines aloud. They were not perfect, but they were honest. And honesty, she thought, was the truest warmth the world could offer. When she finished, she folded the pages neatly and tied them with a ribbon. Not for London, she decided, not for the Chronicle, nor for any reader beyond these hills. This story belonged to the land that had shaped it to Whitby, to her mother, to her children, and to the memory of those who had endured before her. Outside, the sound of laughter carried faintly from the direction of the sea. Thomas's voice, bright and clear, followed by the deeper rumble of his father's. Clara's giggles joined them, higher and wilder, like a bird's cry carried on the wind. Eleanor stepped outside into the morning. The air was crisp, the grass slick beneath her boots. The mist had lifted from the fields, revealing the horizon in full, the sea silver and calm, the cliffs bright against the sky, and beyond them, the sun, rising higher than it had since autumn. Her mother's voice echoed faintly from the open doorway behind her. "It's strange, isn't it? How the light always finds its way back." Eleanor turned, smiling. "It never leaves. We just forget how to see it." She walked down the lane toward the village, her breath clouding in the cold air. The church bells began to ring again, steady and confident, their sound weaving through the morning mist. The candle in the window at Whitby Hall still burned faintly behind her, though the sun had long overtaken its light. As she reached the crest of the hill overlooking the sea, Eleanor stopped. The view before her was vast and gleaming, every wave catching the sun like a mirror. It looked endless, not frighteningly so, but beautifully, achingly endless. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the salt air, and whispered the words she had written that morning. "The world waits, the world endures, the world remembers." And as the bells echoed from the village below and the sea stretched its arms to meet the light, Eleanor felt, for the first time since the long winter began, that her journey and the story of it had finally come home.